Okay, fantastic. Okay, so we're welcome to have Johannes Matschke. He's talking about national interest spillovers and macroprudential coordination. For those of you who are new, this is just a regular seminar format. So if you have a question, just unmute yourself and jump in, and we'll also leave some time at the end for further discussion and questions. Okay, Johannes, go ahead.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Johannes. I'm a job market candidate from UC Davis. Now, before I get started, I really want to say thank you to the organizers. I think this is a great opportunity for me and the other presenters to get some external exposure to our work. Now, feel free to interrupt me anytime during the presentation. I always have somewhat difficulty in figuring out when someone asks a question, so feel free to just unmute yourself and interrupt me. So the talk from my part today is going to be about financial frictions, financial regulations, and the specific topic that I'm interested in is essentially the difficulties that international policymakers, international regulators tend to have with setting up international regulatory standards. And before I get to that, I want to start with some background information. So it turns out that essentially since the end of the Bretton Woods era, and specifically over the last 2-3 decades, we've witnessed a dramatic increase in the size of international financial markets. The trading volume went up by a lot. At the same time, we're essentially in a situation where almost every country is somewhat financially interlinked with the rest of the world. And there seems to be somewhat a consensus that this has implications for global financial stability. And people or researchers and policymakers seem to identify two key issues. The first one is the financial spillovers, and that's essentially work between banks and across countries. And if we'll just look at some historic data over the last 20-30 years, then we'll witness an increasing amount of financial crisis and banking crisis, even if we ignore the recent financial crisis. So that's one issue. The second issue is that these financial markets nowadays, they are very complex. There are many players on it. And it seems to be somewhat difficult to come up with an appropriate regulatory response. And the issue that I focus on in my job market paper and this talk is one about coordination, the coordination of regulation. And this is specifically problematic because domestic regulators, they tend to have a somewhat domestic mindset. So if you're the regulator of the US financial sector, then you primarily care about the banks that operate in your jurisdiction, but you're less concerned, say, about banks in Europe or banks in China. So domestic regulators, they seem to primarily care about domestic financial sectors. Hence, they do not care about the spillovers of domestic financial markets on banks and foreign financial markets. And that seems to be somewhat problematic with regards to coming up with regulatory agreements. Nevertheless, there's actually very broad policy and research support for some kind of international regulatory standards. So the international institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD, the BIS, they really push for some kind of international regulatory guidelines. The problem, though, is, and that really gets me to my job market paper, there are many countries that are reluctant to these standards. And so in my paper, I'm going to focus on the Basel agreements, which are the most comprehensive international regulatory set of guidelines. These guidelines are fully voluntary. They pertain to capital regulation, liquidity regulation, and some supervisory guidelines. But it turns out when you just look at data and you focus on the two most recent agreements, the Basel II and III framework, then with regards to the Basel II framework, we'll see that around 20% of the countries in my sample, and I'm going to explain that sample later on, they did not implement any of these Basel II guidelines. And these Basel II guidelines, they were issued in 2004. This is data of 2015. So they've had a lot of time to implement these guidelines. And if I refer to the Basel III framework, which is somewhat more recent, originally published in 2010, then the share actually increases to more than 50%. And that is somewhat striking. So there are lots of countries that are reluctant to implement regulatory guidelines. And it turns out most of these countries are small open economies. They tend to be emerging markets or developing economies. And that kind of leads me to my research questions. Is there something about these countries that do not seem to adhere to regulatory standards that makes them somewhat special? In other words, is there a specific variable or specific determinant that explains why some countries regulate while others tend to free ride on foreign regulation? And it turns out that in the literature, this is somewhat puzzling. So the literature has come up with a bunch of explanations, but these explanations have two issues. The first one is that they are somewhat reduced form, they lack a structural interpretation. And the second problem is that most of these explanations have no empirical relevance. And so what I'll do in the stock market papers is that I come up with a new explanation that ultimately explains why certain countries regulate and others do not. And I'm going to argue that I have theoretical and empirical support for this explanation. The second research question that I'll address in my stock market paper kind of builds on the first one, and that is, given that certain countries may rationally decide to free ride, is there something that international organizations, here you can think about the World Bank, the IMF again, that they can do to essentially align the interest of those free riding countries towards regulation? Now, before I get into more details, just want to essentially get the key takeaway away. And I'm going to argue in this talk that is essentially one explanatory variable that is able to explain why certain countries regulate and others do not. And this unique variable is the size of the domestic banking sector. And I'm going to argue that countries with a larger domestic banking sector, they are more likely to adhere to international regulatory standards than countries with a smaller banking sector. Now, just to start, I want to provide some data right here. So on these two histograms are essentially plot the share of countries that adhere to these Basel II or III standards. I'm going to split them between countries that did not implement any of the Basel II guidelines versus some of these guidelines, and I do that for both Basel agreements. And then I'm going to further split those countries into two bins, and whether they have a large domestic banking sector and a smaller domestic banking sector. And what you'll see right here is that with regards to Basel II, first of all, there are a certain amount of countries that do not regulate, that do not follow these guidelines, and specifically countries with a smaller banking sector that do not follow these guidelines. And the same kind of pattern emerges with Basel III. Again, we'll have primarily smaller countries with a smaller banking sector that do not adhere to these standards. And now, obviously, overall, we see that there are a lot more countries with regards to the Basel III agreement that did not implement any of these guidelines. So one question I frequently get at this point is that, I'm essentially arguing that it is countries with a smaller banking sector that do not regulate. And then the natural question, the follow-up question is that whether this has any aggregate significance. After all, these countries have a small banking sector that should not necessarily affect global financial stability. And I'm going to argue that, well, this is true partially, but it turns out that these countries, although they have an individually smaller banking sector, they actually sum up, if you aggregate them, they aggregate to a significant portion of the overall global financial sector. So in other words, I'll have a statistic in the paper. If I focus on Basel III and countries that only poorly implemented these guidelines, then these countries in sum aggregate to a financial sector size that is about 40% relative to the US. And most of these countries do have a small banking sector. So in other words, this channel that I propose and the issue that many of these countries do not adhere to these guidelines tends to have some aggregate significance for global financial stability. So what do I do in my paper? I would say my paper has a theoretical component and an empirical component. I would say the focus is on the analytical side. So what I do is essentially I set up a model. In that model, I study the strategic interactions between national regulators, and I do that in a model of liquidity regulation. And the type of regulation here I'm interested in is prudential regulation. So here I'm talking about regulations that regulators impose ex ante to improve financial stability and then prevent potential future financial crisis. This model has, I think, one unique key feature, and that is an international asset market that is subject to fire sales that arise due to some liquidity shortages. On the empirical part, I'm really interested in explaining the adherence to the recent Basel II agreements. And it turns out that both in my model and in the data, I'll define the size of the domestic banking sector as the unique observable variable that essentially drives all my results, both in the data and the model. So what is the key idea for why the size of the domestic banking sector matters? The key idea is as follows. So we have national regulators. National regulators tend to have a domestic mindset. They primarily care about domestic utility. As such, they do not internalize when they make their regulatory decisions. They do not internalize how their decision affects banks in foreign countries. And if we have countries that are very asymmetric with regards to their financial sector size, then we end up in a situation where the planner or the regulator of that country with the large banking sector internalizes more of these spillovers, more of the inefficiency in international markets, and that regulator is going to have a higher desire to regulate. And if these preferences are sufficiently asymmetric, it is not going to be possible to adhere to common regulatory standards. So let me jump to my findings. With regards to the model, I think the first finding is that national regulation is inefficient. I'm not claiming I'm the first one who derives that. That's something that seems to be agreed upon in the literature. So let me jump to my second finding, and that is that free riding can actually be a rational choice, and is specifically a rational choice for countries with a smaller financial sector. And what this implies in different terms is that it may ultimately not be possible to come up with a regulatory framework that is implemented by almost all countries, precisely because free riding can be a dominant strategy. Then, based on my model, I'll have two mechanisms. I'll derive two mechanisms that can potentially solve this dilemma, and hence essentially align the interests of those free riding countries towards regulation. And those two policy recommendations would be some kind of capital flow restrictions or a system of transfer payments. With regards to the empirical section, I'm going to show you that it is the size of the domestic financial sector as the only relevant explanatory variable with regards to the adherence of the Basel II and III frameworks. And I'm also going to show you that the alternative explanations that have been proposed in literature seem insignificant. In other words, they don't have explanatory power. On top of that, I'm also going to show you that the sensitivity of this financial sector size as an important determinant is particularly large for open economies. And intuitively, that makes sense if you're an economy that has strict capital controls, that the economy acts like a closed economy. Hence, there is not really a reason to adhere to international regulatory standards. Now, with regards to the literature, I don't plan to go over all of these papers, but I want to kind of briefly highlight how I fit into the literature. And I think I'll belong to kind of three different literatures. The first one is a literature on pecuniary externalities and fire sales. So pecuniary externalities are a specific type of externalities that essentially work through equilibrium asset prices. This type of externality is probably the one that's most extensively studied. So in my framework, I'll adopt that idea. I'll have a pecuniary externality in my model, so I don't really do anything new on that side. But what's somewhat different in my framework is that I'll essentially embed this pecuniary externality in an international financial market versus a closed economy. The second literature that I relate to is the literature on liquidity demand. I want to highlight two seminal papers here. First one, Diamond Dipwick, and the second one I'm somewhat related to is the paper by Allen and Gale in 2005. Again, these papers focus more on liquidity demand in a closed economy. I'm instead interested in liquidity demand and ultimately portfolio choices in a more international context. The third literature that I relate to is probably the one that I'm closest to. There's actually a very, very small literature on a cooperation on international regulatory standards. Now, you can really count those papers with your two hands. There's not a lot in this area. There's one key paper that I want to highlight. That's the paper by Kornick 2016. And in that paper, he essentially states a benchmark result that cooperation is always well and for improving as long as you have some kind of externalities that work through international markets. Now, obviously, that is going to be satisfied in my model. I'm going to have a pecuniary externality, but the implication of that result is that, cooperation will always be well for improving, but in reality, as I've just shown you, and in those histograms, we'll see that a variety of countries do not follow that. So in order to kind of match the data, you'll need some model that features some asymmetries such that in the end, some countries may not be better off with cooperation despite international externalities. And the asymmetry that I introduced in my paper is this financial sector size asymmetry. Now, there have been very few other papers that introduce different types of asymmetries. I listed those papers down here, and I'm gonna get back to their channels later on once I get to my empirical section, where I want a proxy for their explanations and essentially show that their explanations do not have any empirical relevance, unlike the domestic financial sector size, which I push in this paper. All right, so what am I going to do for the remainder of this talk? I am going to introduce the model. I'm not going to go into too many details. I do want to highlight the key features. Then I'm going to provide a quick overview of my main results. Following, I'm going to jump to these two policy recommendations that I have, and then I'm going to provide some empirical support for the channels that I uncovered in my theoretical model. All right, so let me start with the framework. It's a two-country model. We'll have 3 periods, and we'll have essentially a continuum of investors and banks. So we have essentially 2 entities, investors and banks. Now, how do I introduce 2 countries? I think I do that in a very straightforward way. I'm just going to argue that a share omega of these investor banks, they live in one country, and the remaining 1 minus omega, they're going to live in the second country. And this parameter omega is going to be a very crucial parameter in my model. It is ultimately going to determine the size of the domestic versus the foreign banking sector. And what I'm ultimately interested in is whether it's possible to coordinate on common standards, essentially as we move from omega equals 0.5, where we have equally sized banking sector, and then we'll either move to either 0 or 1, meaning that one of these banking sectors becomes relatively large at the expense of the other banking sector. Now, there are 2 entities, 2 agents in my model. I have investors, I have banks. The setup for investors is, I think, fairly standard, follows Steinman-Dybvig. So here the idea is that investors have some initial endowment, but they don't consume in the initial period. They only consume in period 1 or 2. Hence, their endowment is deposited at banks. And the really important factor here is that these investors in the second period, they receive an idiosyncratic liquidity shock. That is the only source of uncertainty in my model. And this liquidity shock ultimately determines the consumption profile of investors. If they receive that shock, they would like to consume in period 1, in the second period. Alternatively, they only want to consume in the last period. That's pretty much Steinman-Dybvig, so that's why I don't want to go into further details and instead focus on banks a little more. The setup for banks has some analogies with Allen and Gale. So the idea here is that banks receive some initial endowment, and they'll have to make an investment choice before they learn about the type of their investor that they are matched with. So they have to make an investment choice between short and long assets, not knowing whether they will be matched with an investor that demands some consumption goods in period 1 or not. Banks have access to 2 assets, a short asset and a long asset. In an equilibrium, the short asset is going to be more liquid. The long asset is going to be more illiquid. That's why I use those terms interchangeably. The short asset has a lower return. However, it can be used to essentially satisfy these liquidity shocks by investors. These illiquid assets have a higher return, but they require 2 periods to materialize. In other words, you can't use this asset to meet the consumption requirements or liquidity requirements of investors if they receive this liquidity shock. The unique feature of my model pertains to this international financial market. So essentially, I set up an international financial market in which all banks from both countries can interact with each other, in which they are essentially able to trade liquid and illiquid assets. This international financial market, is supposed to capture some key characteristics of interbank markets during financial distress. So think about the 2008-2009 financial crisis. This market has 2 key characteristics. The first one is that it is fully collateralized in the sense that banks in this market cannot borrow liquidity unconditionally. They'll have to provide some illiquid assets as a collateral. And again, I think this is a very reasonable description of the recent financial crisis, where interbank markets essentially froze and banks actually had to provide some of their illiquid assets in order to obtain or meet their liquidity demand. And this market will be such that in the end, in equilibrium, again, this is endogenous, distressed banks will be required to purchase some additional liquidity, and they will be required to sell some of their illiquid assets in return. The second key feature of this market are frictions. There are several different motivations for these frictions. Most commonly used justification is an adverse selection problem or some search and bargaining friction. Again, there is empirical support for these type of frictions. And the only thing that's really matters for my model is that these frictions will imply that the price of these illiquid assets, so the price of this illiquid assets that distressed banks sell, this is going to be below fair value. That is going to introduce a notion of fire sales, and ultimately that is going to introduce my pecuniary externality. Now here I'll have this model structure. I'll just essentially in the timing of the events in my framework. So I'm actually going to solve this model by a backward induction. So what I'm going to do, and I'm going to show you that in the next couple of slides, I'm first going to focus on this financial market. In this financial market, all banks interact with each other. Distressed banks in equilibrium, they will be required to sell some of their illiquid assets to meet this consumption or liquidity demand. And in tech banks, they will ultimately be the buyers of those illiquid assets. What I'm going to do is I'll derive the optimal supply and demand schedule in this financial market, and then I'm going to take those demand and supply schedules and plug them into my initial portfolio allocation problem, and in which I solve for the initial investment allocation between illiquid and liquid assets. And again, this choice happens before this liquidity shock occurs, but banks in period zero, so when they make their portfolio choice, they already internalize it with a certain probability they will receive this liquidity shock, in which case they are distressed and they have to sell some of their liquid assets, and with a certain probability they will not receive this liquidity shock, and then they will buy these illiquid assets. And then later on, I'm going to contrast this with essentially a regulated equilibrium, where ultimately regulators will make this initial portfolio choice on behalf of banks. So let me focus on this asset market for a bit, because I think that is the key feature of my model. And let me start with distressed banks. So distressed banks are those banks that receive a liquidity shock or are matched with an investor that receives this liquidity shock, and they enter this period with some initial allocation, K and L, and in that period they want to maximize period 2 consumption subject to this liquidity constraint that they have to raise a certain amount of consumption goods. As I already mentioned, in equilibrium, they will be required to sell some of their illiquid assets in exchange for liquidity or consumption goods. And because of these frictions, this liquidity constraint will actually be binding. And I'll have an expression, or the mathematical expression for this liquidity constraint right here. I want to go over it. So it turns out if banks receive this liquidity shock, they have to provide a certain amount of consumption. I denote this consumption as C. That is in turn an endogenous object and ultimately depends on investors' preferences. And they can meet this consumption requirement either by providing some of their own consumption goods from short asset investments in the initial period, or they can sell some of the illiquid assets and in exchange for consumption goods. And if they sell some of their illiquid assets, they're going to receive a price P, which, as I'll show you in the next slide, depends on aggregate liquidity, and that is an equilibrium object. Now, I think this liquidity constraint, it's supposed to capture two characteristics of financial markets. The first one is fire sales. That is because the price that distressed banks obtain is going to be below their fair value, which is R. And the second key element that this constraint captures is the limited access to liquidity, in the sense that distressed banks are required to sell some of the illiquid assets. And I have a reference right here, and Charletti, they actually argue that these type of constraints were present during the financial crisis. So let me focus on InTech Banks for a second. They are less interesting than distressed banks. Again, they enter this financial market with some kind of initial portfolio, and they're really interested in maximizing period 2 consumption. Ultimately, these InTech banks will purchase some of the illiquid assets from distressed banks, but only if the price is right. And whether the price is right or what's the appropriate price ultimately depends on a financial friction, which I capture with this phi function. What this phi function is essentially doing it is going to imply that these illiquid assets that InTech banks purchase on this asset market are going to be less profitable than illiquid assets that were invested into in period zero. And as a consequence, these InTech banks are not going to be willing to pay a price P that is equals the fair value of R. And then you have this kind of optimization problem here. I don't want to go over all of these ingredients in detail, but ultimately this is going to provide you with an illiquid asset demand curve right down here. So let me focus on the equilibrium of this asset market, right? So in equilibrium, we'll have a bunch of distressed banks, we'll have a bunch of InTech banks. Since I have a continuum of banks and idiosyncratic shocks, essentially the law of large numbers applies, and I can just aggregate over this individual demand and supply schedules, set aggregate demand equal to aggregate supply, and derive the equilibrium asset price, which in this case depends on aggregate liquidity. So why is that the case? Suppose that banks invest more into liquid assets in period zero. So initially, because as a consequence of that, they won't have to sell as many of their illiquid assets in this asset market because they have more own liquidity. And that is ultimately going to reduce the supply of illiquid assets. And if the supply goes down, the price will go up. Now here, the crucial point is that banks do not realize this dependency. They do not realize this dependency between liquidity and the equilibrium asset price. And that is because these banks are somewhat small. They do not have any aggregate impact. Hence, they do not internalize this dependency between the equilibrium asset price and aggregate liquidity. And it turns out that this kind of issue, that banks are atomistic and do not internalize dependency, this ultimately introduces a pecuniary externality. This externality is pecuniary because it works through equilibrium asset prices, all right? And that's where the name is coming from. And in combination with this binding liquidity constraint that I just showed you 2 slides ago. And here the idea is that, additional liquidity improves the fire sale price, it stabilizes the equilibrium asset price, and that in turn reduces the tightness of this liquidity constraint. And because banks do not internalize that and the laissez-faire equilibrium, there is going to be a justification for some kind of liquidity regulation. And ultimately, so there is a justification for liquidity regulation, and because this market is international and domestic regulators do not internalize this dependency, there's ultimately also going to be a justification for international liquidity regulation. And in this figure, I'll essentially just display the equilibrium on this asset market or this financial market. The blue line characterizes the aggregate demand curve that is derived based on those InTech banks. The red line characterizes the aggregate supply curve that is in some sense just this liquidity constraint aggregated. And as I just mentioned, if for whatever reasons banks decided to hold more liquid assets in period zero, that is going to stabilize global financial stability. That reduces fire sales, so the supply curve shifts to the left, and that is going to imply a higher equilibrium asset price. And precisely because banks do not internalize this dependency, there is scope for intervention via liquidity regulation. So let me jump to period zero. In period zero, right, that's the period where banks ultimately have to allocate their portfolio, allocate their endowment into a portfolio, and they have 2 choices, either this liquid or this illiquid asset. When they make their choice, they do anticipate that, with certain probability they will be distressed and or not distressed. And in that period, in period zero, they essentially maximize period 2 consumption, subject to this potential liquidity constraint that they might face with a certain probability. And in this period zero equilibrium, I essentially analyze 3 different scenarios. I'm going to contrast the laissez-faire or competitive equilibrium with the national regulation, and I'm going to contrast that with global regulation. So let me focus on these 3 types of equilibria that I analyze. So the competitive equilibrium or laissez-faire equilibrium, I think, is the most straightforward equilibrium. Each bank just chooses her own of liquid assets. In other words, they do not internalize this pecuniary externality, and then I'm going to contrast that with a equilibrium where this one global regulator and the aggregate investment mix of aggregate illiquid.
He's gone. He's gone for all of you guys too? Okay, I wasn't sure if, yeah, we'll give him a second to try to get reconnected.
Huh. It's only the second time it's happened, right?
Yeah, it was, usually it's Dan Ju, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I hope he realizes that he is gone.
Yes, he could still be talking right now.
Well,
And I don't know any way to get a hold of him.
let's see.
I can send him an email, but I doubt he's watching his email right now.
Oh, there he is.
Oh,
He's
good.
back.
Okay, great.
I just had an internet outage.
No problem. Go ahead and get your slides shared again.
I get it back up. I apologize. This happens sometimes here in Davis.
It's no problem. This is
How far did I get?
I don't. Let's see.
We
I
got
think I
past the
stopped
outline.
somewhere right here on this slide, right?
Yes,
Yeah,
right here.
that looks
Okay,
right. Yep.
okay. So then I'm gonna continue right here.
Yep. No worries.
Full screen. Okay, there we go. So I think I did mention the comparative equilibrium. What I'm not sure is whether I conveyed the global equilibrium. I think I stopped somewhere right there. So I'm going to start with that. So in my global equilibrium, essentially I have a global regulator that ultimately sets the amount or determines the portfolio choice on behalf of all banks in this global market. So essentially, a global regulator chooses the portfolio on behalf of banks in the domestic banking sector and the foreign banking sector. And because that global regulator kind of chooses on behalf of the portfolio on behalf of all banks, that regulator is going to fully internalize this pecuniary externality. In other words, that regulator is going to fully internalize the dependency between the equilibrium asset price and aggregate liquidity. And the kind of phenomena that I want to capture with this global regulation is really essentially some international regulatory agreements that have been settled and that are subsequently potentially implemented by all countries. So in some sense, this global regulation would refer to an international agreement. Think about the Basel agreements, but in some sense, refers to a hypothetical scenario where all countries actually adhere to these regulatory standards. And I'm going to contrast that global regulation equilibrium with a national plan or national regulator equilibrium. And in this national regulator equilibrium, I'll have two regulators, one for each country. They have a domestic mindset. They only care about domestic financial stability, and they interact from a technical perspective. They interact in some kind of Cournot equilibrium. And since they only have a domestic mindset, they only choose the portfolio on behalf of all banks in her jurisdiction, and hence they only partially internalize this externality. And so what I'm really interested here is, despite all this technical stuff, is whether these national regulators would be willing to agree on some kind of coordinated liquidity regulation, in which case they would ultimately be in this global regulatory equilibrium. So let me jump to my analysis. What are the key features of this model? The first statement is with regards to aggregate liquidity.
Johannes, this is Rock from Philly Fed. I may have missed it, and I'm not so sure I can blame the internet outage. But what is international linkages, financially speaking, that investors in one country can deposit money in the other country? Is that the international linkage that's across
one
countries?
Way of modeling here. So what I'll do is I'll have a bunch of banks. I'll have a bunch of investors. Each investor is tied to one bank. So in that sense, a bank cannot attract funds from multiple investors from multiple countries, but instead, all those banks are able to interact with each other in this international financial market. So this is some sense in the literature, there seems to be like a trade-off, or there's a choice. I can either focus on really explicitly modeling the interaction between investors and banks and make this very complex, or I can focus on the interaction that banks have with each other. And in this framework, I'll focus on that, and I'll specifically model the transactions that banks have with each other, and I'll focus on that. And I'm somewhat sacrificing some interesting interactions between investors and banks by assuming that there is one investor for one bank.
So just to pursue Rock's question, is the main national issue here the scope of the regulator, or did I miss something in the presentation of the model?
No, you're right. That's ultimately the issue. So the problem is in my framework, and I think something in reality as well, that national regulators, they primarily care about domestic financial stability, and hence they only care or kind of disregard the international aspect that their domestic regulation potentially has on banks or foreign jurisdictions. And because I'll have a market that is international, where we have international interlinkages, these interlinkages or these spillovers are not internalized by national regulators. And that's what ultimately makes this national regulatory equilibrium inefficient relative to a coordinated response.
Yeah, so why can't the two countries just separate? What here is generating interaction, and why can't there's no increase in returns or anything, is there, or have I missed something?
Yeah, so that's a good point. So I think ultimately that's an empirical question. So I agree. If I just split these two markets in two, right, each national regulator would internalize the entire inefficiency, the entire spillovers that are left. So in some sense, yes, I could split these markets in two, and I would come up with an efficient level of regulation. But from a practical perspective, from an empirical perspective, we see that financial markets are highly integrated, and it is not that straightforward to split these up. So this has a more empirical justification, but I agree from a theoretical point, right? Because we have constant returns to scale, as you mentioned, it would be possible to split these two markets, and we would be better, and these national regulators would be able to internalize these spillovers.
Yeah, couldn't somebody take your model and say this is an argument for financial autarky with capital controls?
Yeah, and in some sense, it is this model provides a justification to kind of limit international financial flows, and that's something that I'm going to get back to with my policy recommendations on these capital flow restrictions. But yes, in some sense, there is an argument here for separating these markets, but from an empirical perspective, that seems impossible in reality.
I will argue that, at least strictly speaking, the interbank markets are pretty separate across countries, at least in large countries. There's a clear, fine distinction of what happens when Deutsche Bank borrows in Europe and Deutsche Bank America lends in the US. Is that really two separate markets or not? But there's no question that interbank policy rates are different in different countries. There is a sense of integration, so maybe there is a limitation on how far they can be. But I assure you, the Fed funds rate is not always equal to the ONIA rate or anything like that. There's quite a bit of a divergence.
Oh yeah, sure. But on the other hand, like I also think that the large banks in, say, Europe, they have very strong ties with banks in the US, and they kind of frequently exchange funds and borrow and lend with each other. And these are the kind of transactions that I essentially cover.
I totally agree with that, but that brings the question of what is the regulator regulating, right?
Ultimately, the regulator in this framework is going to regulate the amount of liquid assets that banks are supposed to hold.
But
right? So this is more about liquidity regulation. Banks invest too much into illiquid assets because they do not internalize the dependency between liquidity and fire cells ultimately in equilibrium, and that provides a justification for liquidity regulation in which regulators would post some liquidity standards that go beyond the amount of liquidity that banks would hold in the comparative equilibrium. So in some sense, this speaks to the, with regards to the Basel III framework. The Basel III framework has a large component that is about liquidity regulation, and this is essentially the part that that I speak to primarily.
Yeah, but if you think about Deutsche Bank, what you say is absolutely correct. It has a huge presence in Europe. It has a large presence in the US. It transfers money between Deutsche Bank Europe and Deutsche Bank US. But when it comes to regulating, neither the US nor Europe really determines the liquidity of Deutsche Bank Global, if you want. The US will have some pressure on Deutsche Bank US.
Yes.
And Europe will have some pressure on Deutsche Bank Europe.
Correct.
But neither of them chooses the overall position.
Exactly.
Of Deutsche Bank Global.
And that's exactly what I characterize in my national regulation framework, where essentially each regulator only cares about banks that operate in their own or her own jurisdiction, right? That's this kind of setup. And I contrast that setup with essentially a global regulator who would hypothetically choose the regulation for all banks globally and thereby fully internalizing these spillovers.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, we can discuss this later. Let me jump to my analysis section. I think I have about 20 minutes left. So let me start with aggregate liquidity or the aggregate amount of regulation that would derive that one would obtain in this framework. And I think the first thing to take away is, maybe not surprisingly, that independent or national regulation is inefficient, and that is precisely because national regulators have a domestic mindset. Now that is less interesting, so let me jump to this bank-specific liquidity regulation and essentially summarize my results in this diagram. So let me explain that. So on the x-axis, we'll essentially have the amount of liquidity that the foreign regulator imposes on banks that operate in the foreign country. And on the y-axis, I'll have the amount of liquidity that a domestic regulator would impose on banks in the domestic financial sector. And this red line characterizes essentially all my equilibria in this national regulator equilibrium as a function of the relative size of the domestic banking sector. So let me start with equally sized banking sectors, in which case omega equals 0.5. And in that case, maybe not surprisingly, because we'll have perfect symmetry, both regulators would choose the same amount of liquidity for each of their banks. Now, what happens if I change the size of symmetry? So let's suppose the domestic financial market increases. Then what we'll see is that the domestic regulator not just going to choose more aggregate liquidity. The regulator is actually also going to choose more liquidity for each bank in that jurisdiction, precisely because that regulator internalizes more of these international inefficiencies. At the same time, the regulator from the smaller banking sector is going to decrease the amount of regulation. Now, there are a couple additional features that I want to briefly highlight. There's actually a very large share of omegas, of relative size asymmetries, where the foreign regulator actually would like to deregulate. So if we just take a point up here, for example, we'll see that the foreign regulator would actually impose less liquid assets, or would force banks to hold less liquid assets than banks would do in the competitive equilibrium. That's one thing to take away. The second thing to take away is that we can up in a situation where the domestic regulator with the large banking sector supplies more liquidity than a global regulator would do. And that is because that domestic regulator has to subsidize the free riding country, who is essentially not providing any liquidity at all. And there's actually also a corner solution in which the regulator from the smaller economy provides zero liquidity. But again, I think that the main topic of this talk is about cooperation. So actually, let me get to that. So then the question that I ultimately asked is whether these national regulators, whether they would be willing to cooperate. Now, if they cooperate, they would essentially play the social planner, or they would adhere to the social global planner allocation, because that is by construction the efficient allocation, since that solution internalizes the entire externality of this market. But the question is whether this type of solution is possible, and ultimately that depends on the net gains from coordination. So I've defined these net gains as essentially this triangle omega and triangle 1 minus omega to refer to these both jurisdictions. And these net gains are they consist essentially of the share that represents the relative size of this country or this financial sector. And if they coordinate, they would get a share of essentially the welfare in the global planner solution or global regulator solution. And if they do not coordinate, they would still be stuck in their national regulatory equilibrium. And the key idea here is that if these net gains from coordination are positive for both countries, they would be willing to coordinate. Otherwise, they would not be willing to coordinate. And in this figure, I kind of portray the willingness to coordinate ultimately is a function of the asymmetries in the banking sector. So if we have equivalently sized banking sector, that is when omega is 0.5, both planners would be better off cooperating. That is essentially Kornick 2006, which I mentioned in my literature review. And that is simply because national regulators do not internalize the entire externality. The global regulator solution is strictly preferred, and both would be willing to join. Now, if we'll have more and more asymmetry, then the regulator from the larger banking sector is increasingly willing to coordinate. And that is because that regulator essentially has to increasingly subsidize the free riding regulator with essentially additional liquidity. And the crucial point here is that with regards to the net benefits of the smaller regulator, there is one threshold beyond which it is not rational for that planner to adhere to international regulatory standards, precisely because that planner or that regulator or the banks in that economy, in that financial sector, they benefit so much from foreign liquidity provision, and they can instead invest into more profitable assets that is such that it's not profitable for them anymore to adhere to any kind of international regulatory standards, and eventually split the gains from coordination. So let me summarize this part so far. What I kind of the points that I wanted to make. The first one is that national regulation is inefficient. The second is that the willingness to regulate ultimately depends on the size of the domestic banking sector, because the size of the domestic banking sector determines the extent to which national regulators who have a domestic mindset internalize inefficiencies in this financial market. And if these preferences are sufficiently asymmetric, they are not going to be able to cooperate. And so what I'm going to do next is that I'm going to discuss two policy recommendations that can ultimately align the interest of those free riding countries towards regulation. And let me start with transfer payments. System of transfer payments in this framework would work precisely because there are overall gains from coordination. The problem is just that these gains are somewhat unequally distributed, in the sense that the country with the larger regulator disproportionately benefits from international regulation, and the country with the smaller banking sector would actually lose. But because we have aggregate from gains from coordination, it's always possible to redistribute these gains such that everyone is better off. I think the system of transfer payments may be less interesting than my capital flow restrictions. And on top of that, I think there's one issue with that, and that relates to the problems that one would face implementing that in practice, because how these transfer payments would have to be like is that they would have to originate from countries that already regulate, and they would have to be directed towards free riding countries, and that would ultimately subsidize free riding behavior. So that is probably politically not feasible. One way I think one could implement some of these ideas is that if these requirements, or if one would impose a requirement to adhere to international regulatory standards as parts of other agreements which are primarily beneficial for free riding countries, such as free trade treaties. Those are primarily beneficial for countries, for emerging markets, small open economies. Those are the countries that tend to free ride on foreign regulation. So one could link these free trade treaties for example, with a requirement to adhere to international regulatory standards. Let me turn to my second policy recommendation, which I think is a little more interesting, and that is, I argue that a threat, it doesn't have to be actually implemented, but a threat to impose some kind of capital flow restrictions on free riding countries, that this may ultimately imply a corporation. And the reason why this works is because free riders tend to have a smaller banking sector, and they essentially face the following trade-off. They could either adhere to international regulatory standards and as a consequence access foreign liquidity, which would help them to insure against financial shocks, or the alternative would be to not cooperate, but in this case, international financial flows would be restricted, then there would not be much access to foreign liquidity, and that would essentially limit the ability to which these countries can insure themselves against financial shocks. Now, it turns out in my framework, the first argument always dominates the second one, but that is in some sense because of the specific preferences. But I assume in a more realistic setting, whether option 1 or 2 dominates ultimately depends on the risk aversion of regulators and banks.
So, Johannes, I'm still confused going back to our previous discussion. I thought the only risk here was investor specific. I didn't see country shocks.
Yeah. So yes. So here I'm essentially, that is a very good question. So here I'm essentially taking the limit where one of these countries is extremely small, right? And in that case, once I take the limit, these countries, for these countries, the law of large number in some sense doesn't anymore apply. So you can't just.
So you've really become granular.
Yes, that's the idea. That's the idea.
Okay.
But I mean, this is somewhat empirically relevant, because we'll see that the countries that tend to free ride on foreign regulation are really countries that are extremely small with regards to their financial sector. So let me contrast these results with the literature. So in the literature, capital controls are usually imposed, or there's a justification for capital controls for 2 reasons: either to address a domestic externality, or to ultimately gain an advantage relative to other countries via some, say, terms of trade manipulations. And the motivation for capital controls in my framework is somewhat different. Capital controls in my model eliminate inefficient spillovers. That is, they increase the welfare of countries that already regulate, because they eliminate inefficient spillovers from free riding countries. At the same time, these capital flow restrictions may force countries to adhere to international regulatory standards as a somewhat third best outcome. So in some sense, capital flow restrictions in my model work in favor of a globally efficient allocation of portfolios. Now, that said, obviously there are some difficulties with capital flow restrictions that has been documented in the literature. One problem are leakages. It's a very nice paper by Arnott, and in that paper they document that there are a significant amount of leakages despite capital controls. Another problem, obviously, is the shadow banking sector. It's not clear how we would want to regulate that. But I mean, in some sense, in terms of practical implementation, what I suggest is that, the World Bank, the IMF, they have lots of funds that are directed towards countries if they are in an emergency, if they suffer from financial distress, and what could link these requirements, for example, to a willingness to adhere to international regulatory standards. So that would be the practical policy application here. So I think I have around 5-10 minutes left. Let me briefly get to my empirical section. The empirical section is supposed to kind of back up my claim with regards to the size of the domestic financial sector as the unique explanatory variable. And I'm going to specifically focus on the Basel II and III agreements. So I have to measure the adherence to these regulatory agreements, and I'll use survey data from the Financial Stability Board. I think it's a very neat data set. Unfortunately, it only goes to 2015, so I do not have more recent data. But the nice feature of this data set is that it contains around 80-90 countries, and for each of these countries, I do know the number of guidelines, or the specific guidelines, Basel II and III guidelines, that were implemented at each point, so at each year. And so what I'll do is essentially I construct an aggregate index over those individual guidelines that have been implemented, I add them up, and I construct an index that measures the overall adherence to these regulatory standards. That is going to be my dependent variable. Now aside, as I kind of briefly mentioned, the Basel framework goes well beyond liquidity regulation, which is at the heart of my model. I'm going to focus on this overall adherence to regulation, but I do have some evidence in the appendix that my results also hold true if I just focus on liquidity regulation, which would be the immediate match to my framework. Now, in terms of explanatory variables, the obvious most important explanatory variable is the size of the domestic banking sector, and here I use as a proxy the amount of domestic credits by domestic banks. That is not a perfect proxy, but it seems to be the one that is used in the literature. And then with regards to other control variables, I'll try to proxy for explanations that have been proposed in the literature. One would be past banking crisis. That's something you previously hear. If they had a past banking crisis, they are more likely to adhere to regulatory standards. That's one argument. I also consider the legal and institutional environment, the profitability of domestic banking sectors relative to foreign banking sectors. And here the idea is that if you have a banking sector is more profitable, you do want to regulate less. I also consider the concentration of the banking sector, so whether it makes a difference if I have one large bank or multiple small banks. And then I also consider the fiscal space and the overall size of the economy. So let me jump to my results. I want to point out a few aspects. The first one is the size of the banking sector, which I proxied by credit. That variable is the only significant variable, and it's positive in the sense that a larger banking sector it leads to a higher likelihood of implementing more of these Basel II standards. The results for Basel III are almost identical. That's why I don't show them right now. All these other explanatory variables are insignificant, except for the size of the overall economy. So one might be worried that, well, maybe it's not about the size of the banking sector and more like about the size of the overall economy. But when I include all control variables, you'll see that it's really the size of the domestic banking sector that matters. And then with regards to column 7, column 8, I specifically focus on a subset of countries which have an open capital market. And what you'll see in column 8, that if I condition on countries that have few capital control restrictions, the importance of the domestic banking sector as a determinant for international regulation increases, the overall fit of the model increases as well. So I think that's kind of reassuring, but it might intuitively make sense. If you're a closed economy, then you don't really care about international regulatory standards, and I see that by comparing column 7 and 8. Now, this in this figure, I essentially visualize my regression results. So these are margins plots, and on the x-axis, I'll have the size of the domestic banking sector, and on the y-axis, I have the probability of implementing zero policies. And what you'll see both for Basel II and Basel III, you'll see that once the banking sector increases, it's less likely to implement zero Basel II or III guidelines. Now, let me wrap this up real quick. So what have I done, or what do I do in my job market paper? I study the strategic interaction between national regulators, and I do that in a model of liquidity regulation. As a novel feature of this model, I'll have an international asset market that features international fire sales. These international fire sales ultimately justify regulation, and because they spread internationally, they ultimately justify coordination. But I also find that depending on the size or the relative size of the domestic banking sectors, it is not going to potentially be possible to come up with an agreement that is implemented by almost all countries, and that is consistent with the empirical evidence on the Basel II and III agreements, where we have a fair share of countries, primary small open economies, emerging markets, with a small banking sector that do not adhere to these standards. I'll have some data that supports that. Now, I do want to be honest, this empirical section in some sense lacks a proper identification strategy. So that is definitely one drawback of that. And then with regards to policy recommendations, I'll essentially show that you can enact a system of transfer payments or some kind of capital flow restrictions that would work to ultimately align the interest of those free-riding countries towards regulation. Now, with that said, I want to add one more point here before I finish, and that I think speaks to the, in some sense, biggest limitation of this paper. It's an analytical framework. In that sense, I'll provide a justification for coordinated liquidity regulation but I do not provide any numbers. I do not quantify these gains from coordination. That is something that I might do in the future work, and provide a more quantitative framework where I can actually characterize these gains from coordination. I expect them to be somewhat larger than for monetary policy coordination, and that is precisely because financial markets seem to be somewhat nonlinear, will have nonlinearities, will have financial frictions that amplify shocks in a nonlinear fashion. So I do expect potentially that these gains are somewhat larger than for monetary policy coordination. But I leave that for future work. And at this point, I just want to say thank you for listening to my talk. I imagine the time is up, and I'm happy to answer questions either now or after the next two presentations, and I'm going to leave it right here. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thanks, Johannes. So we are going to have some time for discussion. Yang, who goes next, is going to kick off at 1:15. So we've got about 10 minutes or so for that. So for those of you who need a break, this would be the time to do it. Otherwise, chime in with questions or.
I have a question, Johannes. So when we look at the Europe debt crises, we saw that they were preceded by a huge amount of the European Monetary Union interbank loans. But I'm not sure that they fall. I mean, I think it is in the same spirit of what you're talking about, but I'm not sure that you captured them with your distinction. Like Spain had much looser regulations than Germany, and German banks lent Spanish banks an extraordinary amount of money. Is that a kind of thing you can capture at all, or not?
In a somewhat abstract manner, yes. So if you, for example, view Germany as the big country and Spain as the somewhat small country, right? Then my framework would suggest that the larger economy, in this case Germany, would impose more regulation than the country with the smaller banking sector, in that case Spain. And ultimately what I show in this framework, right, is that there is precisely banks from these large economy that ultimately provides these funds, this liquidity towards the economy with the smaller banking sector. So I think, yes, in a very abstract manner, I think I capture this phenomena, yes.
No, but in an abstract manner, they're not a data point for you, right?
No, they are not data points for me, right? So it's true. So I think the mechanism that you described applies to my framework, but I agree it's not a data point for me. And in my empirical section, I'll focus on the Basel regulations, right, and not some other types of regulations. So we do have other alternative regulatory frameworks, like this framework by the G20. We have specific regulation for the European Union, but I don't have that in my empirical section. But I'm arguing that the idea that's driving the results in my model would be applicable to the scenario that you described.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I got that, but it doesn't fit into exactly where they stand in terms of the Basel Accords.
Yes, with regards to that, yes. So it's true. It turns out that both Germany and Spain adhere to the Basel requirements. That's true. So in that sense, yeah, I see your point, right? But with regards to the Basel, or the countries that I have in mind in my framework to kind of fit it to the data, for example, you could think about this big country in my framework as, for example, the countries that are already regulating, or the Eurozone as a whole, or maybe the US. And then you can think about this smaller economy as some kind of emerging market. So that would be the proper matching to the empirical exercise that I have. Yes.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you. Good comment.
So I'll ask you or make a comment or suggestion. So I was thinking about how I would want to apply your model to the United States before there was lots of regulations, and states were kind of separate. Is there a way of thinking about how Rhode Island or Delaware would choose its capital standards differently than California before there was kind of interstate banking and as much oversight, national oversight? Should we think about your model in that context as well?
Well, yes. So I think you would have to stretch the model very far to really speak to that issue. But suppose we're in the US where we have essentially regulation by each state separately. So essentially before this Federal Reserve Bank and all this stuff came up. And yes, in that sense, my model, the prediction of my model would be, say, one state is California, the other one is Rhode Island. The implication would be that, well, Rhode Island is not going to impose some significant amount of regulation, but California does. Now, I don't have the historical information on whether that's actually that's what actually happened in the past, but that would be the implication, yes. And it seems like that I'm not that familiar with this issue, but it seems like that Rhode Island tends to be very lax on certain kind of regulatory standards and specifically taxation. Now, I don't have the empirical or historical evidence to back this up, but yeah.
You know someone who knows a lot of history, right?
I do know. I just have to ask them.
Yeah.
But yeah, my model would speak to that in a very abstract manner. Yes.
I know it'd be great if you could apply it to that and somehow
that's a good point.
Show a similar result.
Yeah.
Because
No, in my framework, you know, I apply this to the Basel regulation, and so I'm essentially like really talking about one large country. I think about a block of countries that are already regulating. But I agree, you can really narrow this down and focus on essentially two provinces or two countries individual, and how and what would be the implications for that. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, everybody. So we'll get started. I think we'll get started in about 5 minutes here. Anybody who needs a break can do so. Yang, you want to go ahead and let's test your screen share real quick, make sure it's running.
Sure. Is it working?
Yeah, that looks good. Okay. Good.
Is my voice loud and clear?
Yes.
It is. Yep. Yeah, you sound good.
Thank you.
So these are different than conferences when we kind of have a little chit chat on the side, right? It's, everyone kind of just looks at each other.
No cookies either. Normally conferences are when I get all my chocolate chip cookie eating in. Maybe somebody can send some over to my house.
I just got pizza delivered from Naples, Italy. So next time I'll get some cookies delivered to you, Kim.
Is that possible?
It is. It's amazing. I'm sure it's just a frozen pizza that came over in like a ship.
Oh, I see. Okay.
The box says straight from Naples. So I had to try it once.
Was it worth it?
Oh no, it just got delivered just now. So
you haven't eaten it yet? Okay.
I haven't eaten it, but you know, it's like, I think it's a frozen pizza. I paid way too much for it, but.
Did you build the pizza oven in your backyard yet? Did you get your pizza oven built? It's coming. Okay.
Not yet. It's coming. Just the skating rink.
Skating rink's in though. That's good.
It's in. Just filling it up this weekend. So.
Now, do you fill it up with the water that was in your swimming pool? Do you just transfer the water back and forth every season, or?
No, unfortunately.
Oh, okay. You have to put in
water's
fresh.
Cheap.
I see. Is it cold enough? It's warm right now. I don't even need a jacket in Wisconsin right now. What's it like over there? Is it freezing?
It's warm today. It's gonna hopefully it'll get cold soon.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's close to 50 in Minneapolis.
Yeah, that's got to be about what it's like here too. Mike, did you get a rink in?
No, the pond isn't. It's taken time for the pond to freeze.
Oh, that's right. You have a pond,
Last week it looked. I could see the neighbors exploring it, and then no, it's interesting because you see the guys that kind of move up close to it and they kind of hit the rink with a hockey stick, and then they back off, and then. But now it's definitely it's melting, so it's nice. No snow. It's good.
Yeah, but Mike, don't worry. Once you have a week where it's below 10 degrees below zero every night, that'll be pretty solid ice.
It'll be solid, right? I was Googling it because I was like, it said it should not look black or gray. And then
just make sure somebody else goes out there first. You'll be fine.
I know. That's why I'm watching the neighbors closely.
Okay, so it looks like it's about time. Yang, we are happy to have Yang Zhou here today talking about the U.S.-China trade war and global value chains. Yang, you've got an hour.
Thank you. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yang Zhou. I'm from the University of Minnesota. So today I'm going to present my job market paper, which is about the U.S.-China trade war and global value chains. So the U.S.-China trade war, which starts in early 2018, is the biggest trade war in the U.S. history since the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in 1930s. So until the Phase 1 agreement between these two countries, which is on January 2020, U.S. has announced to increase tariffs on 550 billion of Chinese goods, and among which 362 gets implemented. And on the other hand, China has announced to increase tariffs on 185 billion of U.S. goods, among which 110 billion got implemented. So if we're looking at the tariffs, the weighted average of all the tariffs on goods before and after the trade war, the U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods has increased from 3.1% to 19.3%, while the China's tariffs on U.S. goods has increased from 8% to 20.3%. So the graph here shows the change of weighted average tariffs over time. So January 2018 is which like before the trade war officially starts, and January 2020 is the Phase 1 deals between the two countries when the trade war temporarily get passed. So the blue curve here shows China's tariffs on U.S. exports, and the red curve is U.S. tariffs on Chinese exports. So the tariff here is a weighted average tariffs weighted by exporting countries' export volumes. So In July 2018, the first round of trade war officially starts. So during this time, US starts to implement 25% of tariffs on $50 billion of Chinese goods. And most of the goods, almost like 95% of the goods included in this round are intermediate goods, which is determined by the broad economic categories. And then in June 2019 starts a second round of trade war. The Trump administration at 25% on another $200 billion of Chinese goods. And in this round, there's more consumption goods included in the list because most of the intermediate goods already are covered in the first round. And in the same year, September 2019, Trump administration at another 15%, add 15% of tariffs on another 112 billion of Chinese goods, and most of goods in this round are consumption goods. So that is a big picture of the trade war. So in general, if we're looking at US increase in tariffs on Chinese goods, it can be generally divided into two rounds. So according to the broad economic categories, the first round is mainly focused on intermediate goods, and the second round is more consumption goods added into the target list. So what are the top targeted Chinese industry in these two rounds? So in terms of industry, so the graph here, so I got this data from the Office of United States Trade Representative. So this graph shows like the top targeted Chinese industry during those two rounds. And so the top one is round one, and the bottom graph is round two. So the y-axis here is the number of HS8 product included in the two rounds. So for example, like in the first round, the majority of goods included the top targeted Chinese industry are computer, electronic products, machinery, fabricated metal products, electrical equipment. So it's more like about intermediate goods. And the second round, the top targeted Chinese industry are textile, apparel, and then we'll see like there's more like agricultural product, food and beverage included in this round. So, and then here comes my research questions. So given that big picture of the trade war, what is the impact of the trade war on different industries and different countries in the presence of global value chains? So basically who wins and who loses. So to answer the questions, I answer the question in the following two ways. So first, I quantify the two rounds of the trade war and find that when tariffs add on intermediate goods, this reduces the US downstream exports, outputs, and employment. And this negative effect is especially strong in those US industries that heavily rely on the targeted Chinese goods. And at the same time, it also benefits the US industries that produce the same type of products. So benefits the domestic producers in the US. And when the tariffs add on consumption goods, it has a greater impact on the US consumers in terms of a bigger increase in consumer price index. Finally, I did a welfare analysis and estimate that from January 2018 to December 2019, while taking the reshaping of global value chains into account, in terms of real income, the trade war cost China by 35.2 billion, which is 0.29% of the GDP in 2017, and cost US about 15.6 billion, which is 0.08% of GDP in 2017. So to answer this, so how I address those questions is I built a two-stage Eaton and Cotton model to study the impact of the trade war while taking global value chain into account. So basically my papers more focus on the long run impact of the trade war. That is, if you give different countries, economies enough time to shift their sourcing places, would be the consequence. So the literature in this field basically found two parts. So the first one focused on the US-China trade war. So previous work has been done by Henley Kamel, Bond, Amit Redding, Weinstein, and Fetchgabon. So compare with their work. So for example, compare with Henley and Kamel and Bond's work. So their work is more focused on empirical work. So they run a regression, like they see the changing tariffs and they see like the changing trade volumes. My work builds a general equilibrium model so that I can do counterfactual analysis. And also I have this global value chain feature in my model so that I can see the long run impact, what happens if countries switching their sourcing places. And compared to Amit Redding and Fetchgabon, I have a multi-country general equilibrium model. So that means I can not only focus on the impact on the US, but also like the China and third countries. So that's about the literature in the US-China trade war. And another part of the literature focuses on the global value chains. So several literature papers really related to my work is one by Antros and Dicotelli and the other one by Caliendo and Parro. So compared with Antros and Dicotelli, I add tariffs as another source of income, as another source of trade cost. So Antros and Dicotelli has iceberg, and I add tariffs as another source of trade cost. And also I have my productivity parameters calibrated to disaggregate trade data, which is different from the way they're calibrating. And compared to Caliendo and Parro, so Caliendo and Parro is a one-stage Eaton-Colton model. So I have different from their work, I have a two-stage model so that I can see like the linkage within industry and the linkage, the global value chain linkage within industry and the global value chain linkage across different industries. So this slide summarizes the structure of my model. So basically, it's a two-stage Eaton and Colton model. So it's a multi-country, multi-sector, perfect competitive, and all goods are tradable and imported from the place offering the lowest price. So I have labor fixed within countries, but mobile across different sectors. So the preferences, the utility is an aggregator of consumption from each sectors. And for the technology, final output in each sector are produced through two stages. So at stage one, the production inputs of the labor are composite intermediate goods. And stage two, the production inputs of the labor, composite intermediate goods, and the output from stage one. And finally, here's my trade cost, which includes both the iceberg transportation cost and the tariff. And here is the explicit format of my model. So for the preferences, I have I stands for country, S stands for sector, and Z.
Can you, so I just had a question about, the model that you're applying to thinking about this. You talked about like short run effects, and I always thought like, doing an analysis like Mario Crucini and Jim Kahn did for the Great Depression in a RBC, a multi-country RBC model would be like the starting point. Can you sort of, where you have endogenous labor and capital accumulation, can you sort of speak to like why you went down this route and why you think this is the better approach?
Okay. So first of all, a lot of literature has been focused on like the empirical. We have done a lot in the short run. Yeah. And so I want to see like what happens if you give countries enough time to shift their to change their sourcing places. In the short run, they don't have enough time to do that. So maybe in the long run, it will the trade war keeps going on. Maybe it will have a larger impact.
Okay. So it's really about trying to estimate the long run impacts if this is a persistent shock and
if it's a persistent shock.
Okay.
What could be the consequence? Yes. Thank you for your question.
Sure.
So so the preferences, so I have like I country as sectors and Z is a variety within each sector. So for the utility function in each sector, that's a Cobb-Douglas aggregators of the consumption from each sector, and BS is expenditure share on each sectors. And for the consumption from each sector, that is CES aggregators of the variety of all the varieties within that sectors. So that's the preferences. And for the technology, so for simplicity, notation simplicity, I'm at Z here. So I'm at the variety here. But this is about the production function for each variety within each sector. So for example, at stage 1, if stage 1, the production in stage 1 occurs in country I, so that's the total output from stage 1 in country I from sector S. So the A here is a unit factor requirement which captures the productivity, and the LIS1 is a labor input at this stage in this country and sector. The big I here is a so the big I is a Cobb-Douglas aggregator, which have a similar format as this utility function, and the gamma here is the equipped labor share. So that's a stage 1. And stage 2, the output, the production process in the stage 2 is similar to stage 1. So we have the unit factor requirement at stage 2. We have the labor, and we have the composite intermediate goods, and also stage 2 relies on the output from stage 1. So as you can see here, there's 2 essential parameters in this production function. First, the labor share, gamma, and second, the alpha, which is the stage share. So alpha conquers how much stage 1 output weight in the stage 2 final production.
So just to clarify, the output of stage 1 for that particular Z is the same as the input at the stage 2 for the same Z?
Yes, exactly. So the Z, okay, so stage 2 is using, so this X here is the output Y here. Like they are the same type of goods. So stage 2 relies on the stage 1. So stage 1 and stage 2 goods in terms of this Y. So, okay, let me put it this way. This Y and this Y here are in the same Z, So this structure captures the linkage within industry. And there's another type of intermediate goods. This I includes intermediate goods from all the different industries because it's an aggregator. But
it's a composite, but the X is specific.
Yes, X is variety specific.
Okay.
And is there anything else you can do? Is there anything else you can do with Y1 besides sell it to the people who make Y2?
Well, okay, so Y1 sell to like people to make Y2, and Y2 at the same time is also the intermediate goods for other industry, right? Because Y2 is included in this big I here. So
okay. How about the I1? Is I1, you didn't give us the equation for I1. Is that aggregating Y2s?
I1 and I2, like they are the same Cobb-Douglas aggregator. Like
I see, it says at the bottom. Okay.
Yes.
The setup, is this part the same as the Antras Digortari?
Exactly.
You're kind of taking that and then embedding it in this structure.
Exactly. Yes. So I also have like this production structure, like maybe it could help. So suppose like I have these 2 sectors. This is the goods from stage 1 and stage 2. Stage 2, you're gonna use the input from stage 1. And then I combine the stage 2 products from all the sector together. So that's a composite. This composite can be used as consumption or used as intermediate goods to both stage. So yes. So So this structure captures like the two types of global value chain linkage. The first is linkage within industry. So that's the industry or the variety specific intermediate goods. So that's the stage 1 output. So by literature, we call it the snake intermediate. And the other one is the other type of GVC linkage is linkage across industry. So that's included in the composite intermediate goods I, which is also the runabout intermediates. Okay, so this setup can give me an analytical solution to my model. So basically, since I have 2 stages, so for example, like if there are like J countries and I have this 2-stage production structure, so it's gonna be 2 square production paths. And so each final goods is produced under one of those J square production paths. So then I'm borrowing this assumption by Antros and Digotali. So traditionally, Eaton and Colton like have this assumption about this Fauché distribution. But since I have 2-stage, if you times up the Fauché, it's not a Fauché anymore. So I'm borrowing this assumption from Antros Digotali is the productivity of a production path follows a Fauché distribution. What do I mean by that? So for example, like the AI1 is a unifactor requirement in stage 1, and that's the unifactor requirement in stage 2. And 1 minus alpha is a stage 1 share, and alpha is a stage 2 share. So this Cobb-Douglas aggregator, that's the overall productivity of a production path. So I assume like this follows a Fauché distribution, and which is captured by the theta, which concurs the heterogeneity within each industry, and the Tj is the overall level of productivity in different countries. So,
do you mean that, is that inequality backwards? It is not a standard product distribution.
I don't quite understand the question. Can you say it again, please?
Oh, okay, never mind. Just I'll keep going.
Okay, so following this assumption, I can get an analytical solution to my model, which I can derive countries' expenditure share on goods produced under each production pass. So for example, I know how much of the automobiles consumed in China has their first stage, like the accessory and parts stage occurs in China, and second stage, like the assembly stage, occurs in the US. So whenever there's a tariffs increase on products from a particular stage or of a particular industry, I can check like how this production places shipped from, how this production shipped from one places to another. And this pi decreases in the tariffs along the production paths. So, and here's the key parameters. I calibrated. So the T here is the productivity level, shows up in the Fauché distribution. So I make it be in country, sector, and stage specific. And then the following 2 parameters captures the production structure of the production function. So the gamma is equipped labor share. I make it country and sector specific. The alpha is the stage share of stage 2 production in final output. That's sector specific. So I calibrate a 3-country and 18 industry model. So the 3-country is China, US, and the rest of the world. As for the 18 industry, so I have one agricultural industry, 1 service industry, and the 16 manufacturing industries. So the data source I have, so in terms of the tariff data, I got this from the trade analysis information system from the World Bank. And unfortunately, the latest data I can get is from 2014, so which is not very good. But I set that as the before trade war tariff. And then about the after trade war tariffs, so I get this, so the Office of United States Trade Representative and the Administration of Finance of the People's Republic of China, they have posted this, the good list, including like which goods are targeted in the trade war, like part of goods are facing like 25%, the part of 15%, and they all have this HS HS codes attached to them. So I basically update my before trade war tariff data and with this new goods list. And the other data I use for calibration is I'm using this OECD input and output, inter-country input and output matrices to calibrate my to calibrate those parameters captures my production structure. So like the gamma, the labor share, and the stage share. And in order to calibrate the productivity, the big T, I use this U.S. International Trading Goods and Services data from the U.S. Census Bureau, and I use the disaggregated trade flows and following the gravity equations to calibrate my productivities. So here's a summary. Like productivity T is calibrated to trade data. So since I have this productivity being country, industry, and stage specific. So the first thing I do is I have like 3 countries and 18 industries. So the first thing I do is I determine the upstream and downstream products in each of those 18 industries. So what I do is I use this US input and output matrices to measure each product's weighted average distance from final use. So what do I mean by that? So actually I borrow this. So this algorithm is developed by another paper of Antras. So for example, like so if there's only one country and one sector economy, and the total value of output is $100. Okay, and I'm discussing like 2 cases here. In case 1, if like all of those $100 is used as final consumption. So the 1 here is a distance index corresponding to the goods, and the numerator is, so the 1 here is distance index, and the numerator is the value of goods corresponding to this distance index, and the denominator is the total amount of good produced. So for example, the total amount of good produced is 100, and the numerator is 100. It means the value of the total consumption. And I said like the distance attached to the total consumption, I said it's 1. So then the upstream index for this particular product is 1. So that's one example. And another example is, suppose still like $100 of output, but among them $50 is used as final consumption and $50 is used as intermediate inputs. So as for the unit requirements, you need 50 cents of intermediate goods to produce $1 of output. So for example, like the first term, 1 is the distance index for final consumption goods. So I have $50 of final consumption goods divided by the total value of output. So that's the first term. And the second term is, in order to produce those $50 of final consumption goods, I need $25 of them, which is 1 step away from final consumption. And the distance index is 2. And the third term is, so in order to produce $50 of final consumption goods, 12.5 of I need 12.5 of intermediate goods to produce $50 of consumption goods, and those intermediate goods are 2 steps away from final consumption use. And I said the distance index is 3. So then take the limit, the upstream index is 2. So as you can see, like the bigger the upstream index is, the further this product is away from final consumption. So at the end, I choose a cutoff point so that I make sure like in each of my 18-inch industry, there's going to be like some upstream products and some downstream products. So the cutoff point I choose is 1.9. So for in each industry, each of my 18 in the industry, for the products with upstreamness bigger than 1.9, I set those upstream, and the smaller than 1.9, I set those as downstream. So, and then at step 2 is I'm going to start to calibrate my T using this disaggregated trade data. So
hang on, Yang, sorry, before you keep going, I'm a little confused on what we just talked about.
Yes.
So I understand that within each industry, you have a bunch of products.
Yes.
And so if we just fix one industry, we get a bunch of products, and some of them are kind of upstream and some are downstream. I'm trying to map that now back to your model. So am I supposed to say that some of the goods are the one-stage goods and the other are the two-stage goods, or what's the?
Exactly. So in my model, I have this two-stage structure, and the output from the stage one, I said those are upstream, and the output from the stage two, I said those are the downstream.
And then are you going to aggregate all those? Is that sort of the idea? All the upstream we're kind of treating as one product, and all the downstream we're treating as another?
So for example, like I'm focusing on the car industry, and all the upstream are all the products related to like cars, accessories and parts, and I aggregate them to get the trade flows, and all the downstream like automobile cars, and I aggregate them to get another trade flows.
Okay, so you're basically taking each industry and breaking it up into two pieces.
Yes,
and calling one like the stage one and one the stage two, and you're drawing the line of which of those products to put on each side by creating this upstream index. And okay,
yeah, which is 1.9 here.
Yeah, would you mind showing us the slide with the model? I just want to see how that maps back into your parameters.
Slides with my model.
Yeah, where you had this one. Yeah. Yes. So is it the alpha S that's going to vary, like, to match that number?
Yes. Yes. So both the T and the alpha S are used to match that number.
So a small alpha, and as alpha S goes toward zero, is going towards 1, you're basically going towards 100 all downstream.
Yes.
And alpha S getting bigger makes it more upstream.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that's exactly what I mean. And okay, so here we go. So after like aggregated trade flows for the upstream and downstream products in each of my 18 industries, and this T is targeted to this U.S. import trade shares. So basically, like how much does U.S. spending on importing goods from a particular country of a particular industry from a particular stage? Okay, so that's how I calibrated my productivity. And for those alpha and gamma, so the alpha is the stage share, gamma is a labor share. Okay, so for the alpha, just as Jonathan has mentioned, yes, so the alpha is measured by this gross output of the upstream products over the total gross output of that sectors. So the bigger the alpha is, like there's more products from downstream, and the smaller alpha is more products from upstream. And then since given alpha, I calibrate gamma to target the value added of over the gross output, because in my production structure, the value added over gross output is not simply dominated by gamma. It's actually also depends on alpha. So given alpha, I'm calibrating gamma to target this moment. So and finally, I did some counterfactual analysis. So this graph is I want to check my within industry global value chain linkage. So what I do is, suppose I have increased the tariffs on upstream products in all the 18 industry. So like in all the 18 industry, I only increase tariffs on the upstream products and see what happens to the downstream products of all those 18 industries. So the graph here shows the change in the US exports, the change in US outputs, and a change in US employment. And the vertical axis is the percentage change, and the horizontal axis is China's shares in US imports in the upstream sub-industry. So the bigger the number is, the more those US downstream industry rely on China. So as we can see, like for an industry will rely more on China, it's going to be more negatively affected in terms of exports, outputs, and employments. So, and also like these numbers are like a negative number below 0. So we can see like this negative correlation between tariffs on upstream Chinese goods and and performance on downstream US industries. And another graph here shows I want to check the across industry global value chain. So what I do here is suppose I fix the tariffs of anything else and increase tariffs on metal industry, and so increase tariffs on metal from China and see what happens to the US industry. And again, I'm looking at exports, outputs, and employment. Vertical axis is a percentage change. Horizontal is the share of intermediate inputs from metal industry. So that matters how much that industry relies on metal industry. So the more that industry rely on metal, the more this industry gonna get hit. So for example, like the fabric metal industry is the one that hit us most, and also like machinery, electrical equipment, motor vehicles, because those are the industries rely a lot on metal.
So
Yes.
Sorry. Yeah, are you going to show us pictures like this, but with the data too? This is all from the model, right? This is from the model.
This is from my model. I just want to use this to justify that my model is making sense here. So, and then this is a third counterfactual analysis, and then I will show you what happens in the data. So here I compare two cases. So suppose the case one is I increase tariffs on Chinese upstream products from all 18 industry, and the second case is I increase tariffs on Chinese downstream products from all the 18 industry. So what happens to the US? So the first column is case one, and the second column is case two. So if I compare them, so in terms of price index, increased tariffs on downstream products has a bigger impact on the consumer price index, because downstream is more closer to consumption goods, final consumption. And then I checked the impact on the producers. So for example, if I increase tariffs on upstream increase tariffs on upstream products from China, this gonna benefits the US upstream industry in terms of their employment and outputs, because those industries are the domestic competitors. And however, for the downstream industry, that's a bad news, because those industry relies on those intermediate goods from China. And on the other hand, it's a similar story. And if tariffs on downstream product, that's gonna protect the US downstream employment, it's going to protect the US downstream industries, but it's going to hurt the upstream. Why? Because I have this runabout structure. So the output at the downstream, I also make it being the intermediate goods to produce the stage one output. So that's a bad news for the upstream guys in this case. So, and the lesson I'm taking from this counterfactual analysis is that the tariffs on imports from China kind of hurts the US industry that relies on targeted Chinese products, and benefits the US industry that produce the same type of products. And so finally, so this is a result I did. And so I replicate this trade wall, and I find what is the top hit and top benefit industry in these two runs. So the first run at the top hit industry is the automotive industry and the agricultural industry. So for the agricultural industry, the reason is straightforward, because the mainly targeted US industry by China is agricultural products. And the automotive industry, actually there's two effects. First, which is also the major effect, is China imposed a lot of tariffs on US cars, which prevent the US domestic producers to ship their cars to China. But on the other hand, the US also increased tariffs on Chinese automotive accessories and parts, which increases the production cost of the US producers. So, and you can see this double attack from both sides of the country through the global value chain. And the top benefit industry, electrical, machinery, and machinery. Now, those are the industries that US heavily increased tariffs on China. And then I have another table for the second round. So the top hit industry in the second round in the US are the chemical and agriculture, because in the second round, China starts to target more on US chemical and pharmaceutical products, and top benefits as textile, rubber, and plastic products. That's because for the same reason, US starts to increase tariffs on textile apparels imported from China, which protects the domestic producers. And I have another number, which I didn't include it here. So another thing I do is, so I have aggregate like all the change of output in agricultural sector and aggregate all the change in manufacturing sectors, because I have like 16 in manufacturing sectors. So I see like the US, in terms of value added, the US lose both in agricultural but in manufacturing sectors in the aggregate level. But the agricultural level like hurt it more compared to the manufacturing. And then the third table is the percentage change of CPI. As we can see, like since the second round has more consumption goods, so it caused a bigger negative impact on the consumers through a bigger increase in the consumer price index. So finally, I did this welfare analysis. So I used the real aggregate real income to measure the welfare. Which is the total wage income and plus the tariff revenue divided by the price index. So I compare two cases. So this is my model. So I have tariffs and iceberg, and this is the one from Antra's model, and they only have like iceberg. They have iceberg as a transportation cost. So so first of all, like the trade war cost China more than the US for both of these two models. And the intuition is that the trade war mainly focused on goods, and the US has been running a trade deficit with China in terms of goods. And so Antra's model, if I exclude the tariff revenue, and the trade war is going to cost a bigger negative effect for both of these two countries. That also makes sense because, I mean, if we don't consider like the tariff revenue in the iceberg word. But in my model, like I let the government collect all the tariff and eventually finance back to the consumers. But one thing I'm gonna work on in my future research is because at this moment, I have like the government collect all the revenue and give it back to the consumer. But in real life, I know like Trump has this subsidized program, like subsidized farmers a lot, like about like 26 billions of transfer. But I don't take that effect into account. But I can do that in the future. And so
can I ask a quick question here?
Yes.
Could you do a comparison to see what you're getting out of having the two layers versus a more simplified one layer to kind of show the results being different?
Excellent question. So I have that as a backup page. So what I'm doing here is the comparing the two layers with one layers. So this is not actually, it's not from the data. I'm just running an empirical experiment here. So the red dashed line is my model, which is a 2 layers. And the blue line, blue solid line is the Caliano apparel. That's the 1 layers. So if I start from autarky, which is a lot of tariffs. And so the horizontal is the scale of tariffs, and the vertical is the gross imports of each country. So, okay, so this is, I'm running a experiment, a numerical experiment, like to a symmetric, 3-country symmetric world. So as we can see, like, if I start to decrease my tariffs, my model is like, is more elastic to the change. So the imports value in my model is more elastic to the change compared to the change in the 1 layers one in Caliano and Paro. And the reason is, so the reason is, so here is the analytical solutions to my model. And the pi is the expenditure share on expenditure share on goods produced under particular production path. So for example, if it's just 1 layers, so which means alpha is 1. Alpha is my stage share. 100% of goods is from 100% of the production is from stage 2. So I'm sorry. So then you can see like the elasticity of tariffs is tau raised it to the power of theta. And but in my model, alpha is smaller than 1, and and you can see like the elasticity is bigger in my model when I include this 2, because I have this theta times 1 minus alpha, and this term is not 0 in my model. So
yeah, could I follow up a little bit? I think the idea, I totally agree with Sam, by the way. But I think the calibration, the example you were showing us is not invariant to alternative calibration strategy. Here, you're holding the model fundamental as the same.
Yes, yeah.
And you were showing us that it's but when you put this to the same data, then the two-stage model is going to give you a different calibration on the fundamentals, right? So then I think it's more like a fair game. You have to show the kind of the alternative calibration and what that gives you, and
yes,
also tell us what's the special role of China there to drive these results, I guess.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Yes, I should include that in my future presentation. Thank you for the advice. Yeah, so, and finally, the bottom line, my estimation in terms of real income, the trade will cost China by 35.2 billion and cost the United States by 15.6 billion. And there's another paper by Fetch-Gavam and Kennedy, like they also did like a similar field analysis, and they do take the tariff revenue into account, but their number is, I think their number is like 7.2 billion of loss in the US, which is smaller than mine. And I think like the reason is, well, in my model, like I have the labor, so I have my labor mobile across different industries. This could possibly like amplify the impact of the trade war. So yeah, so actually I finished up early. Yeah, that's all I got for today. Any questions?
Yeah, so yes, we'll open up to questions, and I'll actually go first. So in the table, are there any other differences between your model and Antras's model? Is this table here to show me the difference between having tariffs versus iceberg costs, or is there something else that's driving the difference between these numbers? I assume they're not calibrating it the same way you are.
So yes. So this table is just to show that the difference between including tariffs and does not including tariffs. And there's another difference is how I calibrate my productivity. And that's also like one of my major contribution is, so an Antras-Stigall tally, and they have this productivity and only being like, they have their productivity being sector and country specific, and they do not divide it like the upstream and downstream things. So I have included that. So that's how my work different from theirs.
Yeah, because it might be that table might be a better comparison if you just do your model with iceberg costs and tariffs, and then do your model with only iceberg costs, right? Just I guess what they're doing is just
yes, okay,
backing up the iceberg costs. And
yeah, I see your point. Actually, like this, I mean, like Antras model actually is my version.
Oh, it's your version of, so it is what I just said. Okay,
yeah,
okay.
It's my version of Antras model.
I call it your model then. Okay, so that is the difference. And so where you've raised the iceberg costs as much as you would have raised the tariffs before.
Yes.
In the other version. So the only difference here is just that in one version, the governments throw all this stuff in the ocean, and in the other version, they rebate it back to, okay, got it, okay.
Exactly, that's what I did.
So I'll ask some questions. So I mean, I'm gonna confirm what Sam and Daniel said is because I'm kind of struggling trying to understand what the multi-stage thing is actually delivering at the end of the day. Like, and I maybe I haven't followed polls and Dago Tri's work close enough, but I just like not at the end of the day, my gut is it's something about it's like what Costas taught us a long time ago was that you just kind of need something to know about the trade elasticity, and then you're done. And then it's like the question is like in that figure that what you're showing us is that elasticity between those two models exactly the same. So the second comment, I'm going to defend the regression guys for a second, which might be a bit strange is, but it's kind of the same ideas. I think the way they're kind of thinking about it is, if I can measure how much the price index moves, then I'm done. And, that's because I'll just plug that into I guess, those guys don't know about the rebated, tariff revenue, but the first order effect is how much the CPI is moving around in response to this. And so again, is there what I could imagine ways in which the multi-stage thing matters there, because Steve Redding's looking at prices for those directly affected, but prices indirectly affected are moving around as well too in response to it. But I think flushing that out a bit more would help.
Yeah. So I totally agree. So you said like, are you saying like maybe you don't see like why it's necessary to have this two stage, and we can have like a
I know. I mean, I think Kim's asked it, Daniel's asked it, Sam's asked it. I mean, Jonathan's kind of questions earlier were kind of about this is like exactly what is the two-stage thing delivering? And like, I mean, maybe it's your want operators. Like, I want to see how like these chains move around across space. Okay, yeah, I need multi-stage production there in that way. But if it's just about welfare, then what does the two-stage thing deliver? And that's what I'm struggling with that. I mean, it goes back to, you kind of brushed off George's question too. It's like, the RBC thing, if I had the Armington model with what like Crucini and Kahn had, set up in the right way, would I get a different answer than what you're delivering me? And that's what I kind of want to know. So.
Yes. I agree with your point. And I have a reasoning for the two-stage thing, but honestly, I'm not sure if it's convincing enough.
No, just tell it. I want to know, like, just like gut, what are you thinking here?
Okay, so if it's one stage, like Kellyanne apparels, so all the final goods is also like intermediate goods, like final and intermediate. You can't like clearly differentiate between final and intermediate. And in this two-stage thing, like I have a kind of like one intermediate goods which is specifically used as input to serve the final goods from the same varieties. And but the one stage does not have that. So I would say like this reasoning is like, because like the two stage is more closer to real life, but in terms of calibration, and I totally agrees with your point. I mean, there's something like one stage can, like two stage can do like one stage, one stage can also doing. So yeah. Does that?
Could I also suggest even, absent what Mike was saying about the welfare, I mean, seems like your model is rich enough to show us some predictions about how these paths will be changing.
Yes.
And that will be also very useful kind of to help us to understand the mechanism at the background of your model. Once you impose tariffs, why it's so special about the China-US paths, how does that switch?
Okay.
At least from like a not normative, but like from a kind of a characterization type of view would be very useful.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. Like that's what, like from this model's well designed to talk about changes in paths from a positive perspective.
Yeah.
And then I guess Daniel, I think, has something deeper in mind, that the U.S.-China path is special relative to other things, and maybe you can get at that and substitution possibilities.
I have a result related to that in my model. So I also did an experiment including third country Vietnam. So from my estimation, actually Vietnam benefits a lot from the trade war, because the number I get is about like 400 millions. And so the reason is like Vietnam is a good substitute for China in terms of manufacturing. So in terms of paths, like a lot of goods like shipped to Vietnam's, and Vietnam has some value. Well, there's part of them like is China's using Vietnam as an exporting platform. That's true, but there's also some part which captures the shift in the production path. Some production actually is gonna take place in Vietnam in the long run. So I guess like the increase in the value added in the real aggregate income in Vietnam captures it is one aspect to reflect the production path shift.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, because at least in the tweets, that was supposed to be part of the purpose of these tariffs, right? Was to increase production at home. And if what happens is we just buy this stuff from Vietnam instead of China, that's an interesting kind of thing to try to measure.
Yeah.
Think about how that works. I mean, empirically, you can measure that, right? You can go to the data and see how trade flows have changed. I think that's pretty interesting. I guess related to what these guys were just talking about, you could do like a short run version of this where they're not allowed to change paths and you just get clobbered by the tariffs. That would be sort of interesting to see. And that's presumably something closer to what Redding and these people who are measuring it just right directly from the data are picking up, right? They're not seeing probably a whole lot of switching yet, at least in the short term. So that would be an interesting experiment to show as well, to help us understand the importance of the switching of different paths.
Yeah, that's
then George is going to ask you questions now about inventories and stuff like that. But it would be an interesting experiment. I think that would help us understand a little more what's going on.
Thank you, Kim.
That's great.
So since I was asked to ask a question, it won't be about inventories, even though they were important in the short run behavior of trade in this event. I actually was interested. I mean, I'll pile on with Daniel and Mike's comments. Like I think understanding the roundabout two-stage stuff is important. In most models, it doesn't matter as long as you kind of keep the trade to GDP ratio constant and then have the elasticity. But my question is really more about the value of the GE model is to look at how like the real exchange rate moves, the terms of trade movements. It would be nice to kind of see what comes out of your model and line that up with the data. Because in some sense, like that's kind of like the important way that kind of the costs get borne on different groups. And my sense is the movements in the real exchange rate were much sharper than what's going to be predicted by this model. So it pushes like more of the adjustment onto China than the US. So it would be interesting to look at that and line it up.
Yes. Thank you, George.
Sure.
What do you think, Kim? Can I jump in and defend Yang just a bit? Or it's better not?
It's not obvious I can stop you. Well, let me say that. Let's do the following then. Let's call this the official end of this talk. And so we'll take a 10-minute break. So if people who want to take a break, so we'll reconvene at 22 minutes past the hour. And then if you want to talk a bit, Tim, I mean, it's America.
No, Yang did a great job. I'm not gonna say anything.
Okay.
I promised I wasn't gonna say anything, and now I'm just tempted to break my promise. You know what I mean?
No, you should keep your promises.
All right, I'm
good.
But we feel like you have something to say, Tim.
Well, yeah. See, here's the thing. I mean, I think in some general welfare sense, the kind of things, George, that you and Mike were saying are 100% right. But you're not going to get some of the sectoral details. So suppose we have a a tax on, a tariff on automobile components. And we want to know what's going to happen to like US automobile exports as a result. She's going to get much bigger increases than a model with just a roundabout, everybody uses the same kind of mix intermediate goods. You see what I'm saying?
Yep.
It's not going to necessarily hit welfare that big, but identifying the sectors in which you expect to see big losers in terms of production, employment, export, and anyway.
No, and that's crucial for the political economy, right? I mean, that's,
yeah,
you know, that's central for, you know, part of why these tariffs went in place. So it's really valuable.
And in fact, I really like Kim's idea of a short run model where you just don't get a chance to change your supplier, and then the impact is going to be much bigger even.
I mean, the other thing you could do too, speaking back to why the sectoral detail might matter, is you keep labor fixed in the short run.
Yes, yes.
Or layer on top of one of these like fancy Roy model things, you know, where, you know, guys, so Kim's laughing. And then, but like that would be a way that you could at least talk to, okay, auto sectors hit really bad because of the nature of this, and that hits the auto guys. Because here there's no notion of that. Like there's no notion of like the auto dudes are hurt from this.
No, that's right.
So you mean like labor fixed within each industry?
You just hold the labor allocation fixed. So you hear like there's like, you imagine a table. Like that I think that table that you got is good. It's a good start. It's like my model with iceberg, my model paths fixed, so I can't adjust. And then you could do my model labor's fixed in the short run. You could like layer on all these kind of elements and kind of think through different stuff. And
Cordub Deacle and I did an exercise where we did that in 2 sectors. And it was really interesting in the sense that if you assume labor mobility, the welfare effects were very small. This was a different exercise of getting rid of the trade deficits. But if you forced labor to stay in traded and non-traded, you got really big changes in wages in the 2 sectors. So you had a huge domestic income distribution effect, which feeds into the political economy considerations.
Yes, I see your point. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Jonathan.
So I have a question about the Z.
Yes.
In the theory, you have the composite intermediate, but then you have the Z specific.
Yeah, the specific.
Upstream and downstream. How do you map that into data, or don't you?
Okay, so that mapping is not very like accurate. So like in the composite goods, so I have this I, right? I have this I, and this I have different like expenditure share from different industry. So like which is the B in composite good, and those I can read from the input and output matrices.
Sure.
And then I have this Z. You mean like the alpha?
Or I mean, what's X and what's Y? Little X and little Y.
What's the X and what's the Y?
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe I should show my slides.
Because you had you took the Z's out. I think you should have left them in, because I think it's the one point where it was really good to know what the Z's are. But yeah, you see, you said that the Y here with the Y1IS, yes, where your hand is, and then we have this X1IS down here in the line below, and you said that was all about the same Z.
Yes.
And I just don't know in the data how you know a Z is like a 6-digit. What are you doing for Z's? Are they like 10-digit, 6-digit?
Oh, because I'm not so my alpha, all my parameters are sector specific, not Z specific. So I'm like, I don't need to check like what happens for an individual product. Actually, I'm aggregate all of the product from that sector to.
Okay, so within the sector, you don't have to say what's upstream and downstream, or stage 1 and stage 2?
Within the Z, I don't have, but within this industry, I have.
How do you do that?
Say it again, please.
How do you decide within an industry what stage 1 and what stage 2?
Oh, the cutoff point here.
Oh, but when you say products, are products inside an industry? I'm just confused about what the data are.
Okay, so the data, the trade flows I have is a disaggregated trade flow. It's a HS4 trade flows in all HS4 products.
Okay.
And then the upstream index I set is to this 451 products. So the number of upstream in the index I have is 451, but the trade flows that I have is like 1,000, like 400 something. So I do a concordance.
Okay, got it. Okay, that's very nice. So I think this exercise of keeping the supplier country fixed would be really interesting, and get the dynamics in there a bit more.
Yes.
I have one more question related to what Jonathan's asking about. What's the difference between a sector and an industry?
Okay, so
I thought you were going to say they were the same, and then I thought I was going to have everything under control. Okay.
I messed it. So in my model, I said it's a multi-sector model, but actually when I do the calibration, I said it's 18 industry model. So the sector and the industry are the same.
They are the same. I think it'd be easier to I think it'd be clearer, just pick one. That way it'll be.
It's a multi-industry model at the beginning.
Sure, and even there's nothing wrong with getting us set up for what's coming later. You can say as you're laying out the model, I'm going to have 18 sectors that I'm going to match in the U.S. data, right? It's that's just helpful. I understand you need like sort of abstracts, so you need continuums and stuff like this to get the math to work out. But in the end, we need to be able to think about how to take this thing in sort of a discrete way to think about it. And I think that would be helpful to just sort of give us a heads up.
But I think that's a good suggestion. Yeah, you don't want to say sector and industry and they mean the same thing.
For sure.
But Kim, what's a little maybe annoying, but it's just a fact. In her model, she really has 36 sectors or industries.
No, I have one agricultural sector.
I know, but when you think of the different production functions, different goods being produced, there's each of the 18 industries have a downstream and upstream.
Yeah, there are 36. Okay, I should stop.
Okay, I guess I was thinking that. Yeah. Okay, I guess I thought we were calling those things products. There are two products within an industry. One is the upstream and one's the downstream.
I'm aggregate all the products, and they'll say like aggregate.
You aggregate it up to only two products in the end.
Yeah, two.
Okay, yeah, okay. This I don't want to hassle you about Samantha. I think everything's. It looks good. So yeah, I don't. Okay, cool, good. So it's actually time to get started on our next paper. Thank you, Yang. That was great.
Thank you.
So our next. Our next speaker is Hundonal. Do you want to put your slides up?
Yes. Okay. All right. Okay. So thank you very much for the opportunity. So I will be talking about my job market paper, which is the gains from market integration, the welfare effect of new rural roles in Ethiopia. So countries spend billions of dollars on road infrastructure every year, and these roads play different roles in market integration. Major roads, which includes highways, trunk roads, railroads, they interconnect different regions of a country or even different countries. And the rural roads connect rural villages to major roads or to the urban centers. And several economic studies have estimated the welfare effect of the major roads. For example, favor for China, highway, elder. And so these trade papers basically focus on these major roads, highways, or railroads that interconnect different regions of a country. And so the welfare effect of rural roads are overlooked, especially in trade literature. There's a small literature in the development economics, and even those papers provide like very mixed evidences on how the rural roads that connect village to the major roads affect welfare in village economies. The most notable paper here is Escher and Novosad, which studies the welfare effect of very big rural road expansion in India. And they find that there's basically no effect on consumption or consumption proxies. But they find that, they facilitate farmers working outside agricultural sector. So there's another paper by Gebrselassie who finds basically no effect on agricultural productivity. So by themselves, roads do not affect agricultural productivity, but when they're combined with other infrastructure such as agricultural extension services, they tend to be more effective. So what I do in my paper is I study the welfare effect of rural roads using a very rich microdata from Ethiopia and a large-scale road expansion project as a source of variation to trade costs to the farmers. Okay. So one thing, estimating the welfare effect of road infrastructure is complicated in the context of village economies, because the first thing is that the production and the consumption decisions of farmers is highly intertwined. In fact, they are mostly made, in most cases, they are made jointly. And though roads affect both the consumption side and the production side of the farmer's decision, so it's not easy to disentangle the exact mechanisms through which the welfare is affected. So here I developed a multi-crop, multi-location trade model that captures the key mechanisms through which the roads affect the village welfare. So in the model, it's a very simple model. On the consumption side, the village decides how much of each crop to consume. And on the production side, they basically decide how to allocate their fixed amount of land across several crops, given the prices of the crops and their village productivity in these crops, okay? So the model gives me some very sharp testable predictions that I take to a panel data on prices, land utilization, and productivity at a village level, okay? So to just give you the overview of the results, so the roads, the model implies that the roads increase the relative prices of a village's comparative advantage crops. And as a result, the village reallocates more farmland to these crops. And that's the way the welfare gain happens. More reallocation of farmland towards the crops in which the village is more productive. Okay. And the welfare gain from this decrease in trade cost varies across villages depending on, is that a question? Okay. Depending on the composition of the village consumption and production crops. Okay. So here, one example here is, I will explain why cash crop village gain more than cereal producing village from a decrease in trade cost. And so my entire exercise is to provide an empirical evidence for this. And I think I have a robust empirical evidence to support these theoretical predictions. Okay. So let me talk about the literature now. So my paper is basically related to trade and development literature, and the trade literature on the welfare gain from market integration. As I mentioned earlier, these papers basically focus on the welfare gains from roads that interconnect different regions. So they overlook probably their focus is not the rural roads that connect like the village to the main roads. So in the development economics, on the other hand, they focus on the rural roads, but the main shortcoming of these papers is that they do not have like a theoretical structure to guide or to pin down the key mechanisms to which the roads or decrease in trade costs affects the village welfare. Okay. So what I do here is I use tools from the trade literature just as a guide to understand how the roads affect village welfare, and to provide, and I give evidences for these mechanisms. Okay. So I will talk about the road expansion project that I'm using as a source of variation. So it's called the Universal Rural Road Access Program. So this was launched in 2011 for a cost of about $2 billion. And in the policy document, the objective of this program was to integrate rural villages to market centers. Okay, so the roads basically, by design, they were designed to connect villages to the nearest urban center or to the nearest all-weather road that connects to the urban center and the rest of the country. So about 63,000 kilometers of roads were built in just 3 or 4 years matter. And as a result, the total road length in the country doubled. And the Rural Accessibility Index, which is basically the fraction of people living within 2 kilometers of road, increased from 25% in 2010 to 55% in 2015. So this is a massive scale road expansion, which had a big impact on the total volume of road in the country. And the phase 2 of the project is still going on. So this is what the road expansion looks like. Here, the red line shows the before this program, the road network that existed. Okay, so it is basically main roads that connect, the different regions of the country or the country to the peripheries or the neighboring countries. So these rural roads, basically, they were designed to connect village to the main roads or to the towns. So as you see, they are very short roads that connect the rural roads to the main road network. Okay, so this is what they look like physically. So these are like minor gravel roads, which work like all season. Okay, now I will explain my data. So I use several sources of data in my study. So the first one is administrative data on the entire road network in the country, which includes information about the quality of each of the roads. Second is the agricultural production and consumption data. So here I have, I use agricultural sample survey as the main data. This is the largest annual survey of agriculture with over 40,000 farmers in about 2,000 nationally representative villages. So this is a panel data at a village level, but in each village, 20 farmers are randomly selected every year. Okay, so this includes plot level information on the area of the plot, the crops that cover the plot, the input usage, and the quantities of production on these plots. Okay, I also use another source of data for agricultural data, which is a panel data on 4,000 farmers in about 3,000 villages. This includes the consumption information of the farmers, disaggregated by crops and also by the sources of the crops, whether the crops are produced by the farmers themselves or whether they are bought from the market. Okay, so I use the price data, which is a monthly survey of crop prices at different level of market. So I have agricultural producer price survey. This is a farm gate price, which is price of crops at the primary market in the village. And I also have retail prices of the same crops at urban centers, okay, in over 100 towns and cities across the country. So I also have other data sets that are the product the GAIS data, for example, gives me village level productivity of crops. And this data is very important data because it gives predicted productivity of village based on a number of agronomic factors such as rainfall, temperature, soil characteristics, and so forth. It is not endogenous to like choice of input. Of course, they give like the prediction of the productivity under different scenarios of input usage, but it has nothing to do with the actual productivity on the ground. Okay. So first, I will give some evidence on the effect of the URR-AP on market integration. So I use two indicators of market integration here. The first is rural-urban price gap. So as I mentioned earlier, the policy document of the URR-AP says the objective is to integrate rural villages to market centers. Okay, so we can test this by just looking at the rural-urban price gap. So just before I explain this equation, so Ethiopia is divided into 10 regions. The regions are divided into 60 zones. The zones are divided into about 683 districts, and the districts are divided into villages. So I observe prices at village and zone levels. Zones are zone capital cities, okay? So what I do is I look at the price gap. This is zone price of crop K in month M and year T. Z is for zone, okay? And this is the price of the same crop in village within that zone. So how does this village, rural-urban price gap changes for village that get road connection compared to village that do not get road connection? So that's the question, okay? So the result is that the rural-urban price gap decreases by 3% overall. But if we look at only perishable crops, vegetables, which presumably have higher trade costs than like cereals, for example, we see an 8% decrease in the rural-urban price gap. By the way, this rural-urban price gap is about, on average, it's about 44%. So it is, even though the distance between the village and the zone capital is just about 30 kilometers or 35 kilometers on average, there is about 44% price gap. So it decreases somehow, especially it decreases for vegetables significantly.
Wait. So who down? Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Yes.
So that's saying like the average price gap's 44%, and then the price gap's going down by 3 percentage points.
Yes, 3 percentage points.
Yeah. Okay. So that's okay. And then I forgot to say. So let me ask. I didn't hear the. How well do you think these prices are actually measured?
How are the prices measured?
How well do you think they are?
Oh, okay. So,
like, is there recall or is it?
No. So this is the survey. So what they do is they have enumerators. The Central Statistical Authority has enumerators in each location who go to the shops. They like random sample of shops, and they actually ask prices. So it could be like if the shop owners identify them as they are non-buyers, probably they may change the price. I don't know, but normally it is like they are collected by the enumerators, trained enumerators who yeah. So quality-wise, it's actually very good. I didn't see any kind of big problem in the data, especially in the price data. Yeah. Go ahead.
I have a question, and probably Dan or Mike is going to have to help me with this. But these roads aren't randomly built, right? Is there some issue with selection or one of these things that I wasn't trained very well at Minnesota to talk about?
Okay, so I will come to that. That's actually the most important part of the work. Okay, so yeah.
Okay.
All right. So the second measure of market integration I use is the correlation between local prices and local yield. Okay, so if under autarky, for example, if each village is by its own and under autarky, we will see that there should be a strong negative correlation between local price and local yields. Like villages that are more productive in wheat should have lower price of wheat compared to village that have low productivity so what I do is, so if this is productivity, this is price, so how does the negative correlation between productivity and the price change once the village gets connected to road? So that's what this regression tries to quantify. So what we find, I find a significantly positive alpha 3. What actually happens is that the negative correlation between this decreases by 1/3. Okay. All right. So now I will go to my theoretical framework. So this is a kind of a toy model, but it does I think the objective. So it built its own SOTA laws, 2018 paper. So just consider a village economy. There are V villages, each indexed by small v, and there are K crops indexed by small k. And these crops can be potentially produced in the village, or they can be imported, and also they can be consumed within the village or exported. Okay, so you can think of a representative farmer in each village. Okay, so the village makes production consumption decision. On the consumption side, very simple preference structure. Phi as preference. This is utility of the village. Q is the quantity of crop K consumed, and sigma is the elasticity of substitution between the crops. Okay, we can reach this by using, we can make like village specific test, but it doesn't really change anything in what I do. Okay, on the production side, again, I make it very simple. I assume a constant returns to scale technology with land as the only input. And each village has a fixed amount of land, which is divided into a continuum of plots of size 1. Because I observe at plot level, so this is very aligned to my empirical exercise as well. So each of the plot has different productivity in the crops, which I denote by Z. So this is the productivity of plot omega in crop K in village V. So the production function given these assumptions is given by this expression where Y is the quantity of crop K produced on plot omega. Okay. So I think that the farmers draw this productivity term independently for each plot crop from a Fresher distribution with this cumulative distribution function. And here, A here is the location parameter, which is simply the unconditional mean of productivity of village V in crop K. And theta is the inverse measure of dispersion. So the higher theta, the more homogeneous is the village land in terms of productivity of the crop. Okay, trade. So the village trade crop in a perfectly competitive market, paying iceberg trade cost, which is specific to crops. And the reason why we need to make the specific to crop is, as I showed earlier, the rural-urban price gap decreases by a different amount for example, vegetables compared to cereals. Okay, so the no arbitrage condition implies that the prices of crops are separated by iceberg trade cost across villages. Okay, so now we solve for the equilibrium land allocation. So each village decides how to allocate its farmland across crops, given the price of the crops and the productivity of their village in the crop. So, since the village's objective is to maximize the return from the land, this implies that each plot of land should be allocated to the crop that gives the maximum revenue among all the available options. Okay, so this is the maximum revenue on plot omega is given by the maximum revenue across all crops on that plot. So this together with the Fresher distribution implies this land allocation rule. This is the main result, which shows that the fraction of land allocated to crop K is higher, the higher is the price of the crop, or the higher is the village productivity in that crop compared to other crops. Okay, so next important result is, so assume that there's a perfectly competitive land rental market. And so in order to drive the equilibrium rental rate, we first have to obtain the conditional distribution of land productivity, the productivity of land conditional on, we know that the land is used for crop K. So this is also Fréchet with this expected value, okay? Now, we use this to drive the distribution of the optimal revenue. So optimal revenue is simply the revenue from the crop that maximizes revenue on that plot. And because revenue is simply given by the productivity multiplied by price in my given my production structure, so the optimal revenue will be, the distribution of the optimal revenue will be very similar to this because price is non-stochastic here. So we have revenue which is also distributed with Fréchet with expected value of 5. We just, because we multiplied by price, this term goes away. Okay, so since land is the only, rental rate of the plot is equal to the maximum revenue from the plot because of the competitive land market assumption, okay? Right, so, and also the measure of welfare in this model is simply because land is the only input, the real rental rate is our measure of welfare. Okay, so now I'll go to the testable implications. So the first is decrease in trade costs should lead to increases in the relative price of comparative advantage crops. This just follows from the no arbitrary condition and the definition of the comparative advantage crops. The more important result is that the decrease in trade costs should lead to reallocation of farmland to a village comparative advantage crops. That means as villages get connected to a road, they should allocate more land to their comparative advantage crops. Okay, so this is the elasticity of the land share of a crop K in village V with respect to the productivity of the village. So this is just follows from the this term. Okay, so if we differentiate this with respect to trade cost, so we obtain this result, which shows that this term is negative because when the trade cost decreases, the price of comparative advantage crop should increase. So this is negative for comparative advantage crops. So this term will overall become positive. So for a comparative advantage crop, a decrease in trade cost should lead to more farmland reallocation to that crop. And the exact opposite happens for comparative disadvantage crop. The second testable implication is the welfare gain from road depends on the composition of the village consumption crops relative to the village production crops. Okay, so this is the welfare is given by real rental rate. Okay, so differentiating this, we obtain this equation. So what this is saying is, so village so here eta is the fraction of land allocated to crop K, S is the fraction of consumption expenditure on crop K. So the welfare gain is the change in price weighted by this as a weight. So think of a cereal producing village. Cereal constitutes a large fraction of consumption expenditure, like 25% of consumption expenditure of farmers. Okay, so for a cereal producing village, if crop K is their comparative advantage crop, they have they allocate more land to this crop, but because this crop also constitutes a significant fraction of their consumption, their gain from the increase in price of crop K is going to be relatively small compared to, say, if crop K is cash crop and the price of that cash crop increases, because there is less consumption expenditure on cash crop, the village with the cash crop as a comparative advantage will gain more. Okay, so these things are they can be directly tested given panel data on land allocation and the prices.
So can I ask one more? So like in a lot of these situations, these guys are growing it for their own consumption. And so
Right.
is that kind of how you want to think about like cereals or rice, for example, in other places, that's That's the primary own. That's going to be your budget share. And you know what? I'm kind of wondering if you don't have that in here. The choice of own consumption versus market production, selling it on the market. But is there a way to think about, you know, at least as a reduced form, some of that stuff showing up in here, or?
So this is at a village level, and so what I observe is how much land each village allocates to cash crops and non-cash crops. What I'm trying to do here is that. So the cereals include like a number of crops. So I'm even aggregating those, especially for this to test this prediction of the model. But I do have, I have for a sample of my farmers, I have how much of their production goes to their own consumption and how much is sold in the market. So I don't have empirical results corresponding to that here, but I do have that data, and also probably I may have in the paper, but yeah, I have looked at like how much marketed surplus changes or marketed production changes after the road connection. Okay,
no, that's good. I mean, that's something in the future, like the entry margin might be worth, that kind of margin might be worth thinking about. But thanks.
All right. Okay.
May I ask a related question?
Okay, go ahead.
On what do you do about zeros? So the model doesn't predict any zeros for consumption or production, right? And I would assume that there are a lot of zeros in the data.
Okay, good point. So basically, in the model, we can say if the village does not produce a crop, you can just assume that the average productivity of the village in that crop is 0. This A term is 0, so that the fraction of land allocated to that crop is 0 in the village. All right, so now I will explain my empirical strategy. Okay, yeah. So as you said earlier, so the main challenge in identification of the welfare gain from the road expansion is roads are not randomly placed, and on top of that, even if we assume randomly placed road, there are other issues. So the first issue is heterogeneity in treatment intensity. So if you connect a village to a dense network and another to a sparse network, where connecting a village in the middle of nowhere, the welfare gain is probably not going to be the same. So we need to take that into account. Another issue is the spillover effect. So when you connect a village, it's not only the village that is directly connected that gains from the road. Neighboring villages, even though they are not directly connected, they may also gain because they indirectly they become closer to road, right? So there is a spillover effect, so that we cannot just do difference in difference because we don't have a good control group. So those villages that are not directly connected are not a good control group. So these two issues can be addressed by using the market access measure that takes into account the entire road network and also the distribution of population across the entire village. So I do that. So instead of binary treatment dummy, I use market access that is calculated from general equilibrium trade models. Okay, so here, so this is the market access of origin village or in time t is. This is the cost of transporting 1 ton of weight from origin village or to destination D in year T. So this is the only parameter that value that changes because of the road. Okay, so population is the same. I use the pre-road program population because it could be endogenous to the road by itself. So this addresses the heterogeneity in treatment intensity to some extent, and also the spillover effect here.
Sorry, I don't. Oh, you're about to talk about selection bias.
Selection bias. Okay, so the main issue is selection bias. So because officials might prioritize village probably based on their potential gain. It just makes sense to connect the village which may gain more than the others, right? So to address this, I use IV estimation. So what I do is I first obtain a predicted road network based on land gradient, the slope of land, and location of rivers and lakes in the country. So what I do is I have regional budgets of roads that was set in 2010 from the very beginning. So each region planned to construct this amount of roads from the very beginning in that 5-year of window. So what I do is, given that regional budget constraint, I connect each village in the region to the pre-existing road network, starting from the village that are very close to the road network until my regional budget constraint is exhausted. Okay, so that gives me a predicted road network that is based on just cost factor, it doesn't take into account settlement of population or any potential gain calculation or something like that. So it's costs, the road network implied by the cost consideration. Okay, so given this road network, I calculate my market access measure that looks like this. Okay, but based on the predicted road network. So I use that predicted market access as an IV for my actual market access. Okay. So first I will talk about the result on welfare. So the measure of welfare is real agricultural income here. So this is log real agricultural income, which is revenue from crop production divided by price index and the size of the cultivated land in the village. Okay, because this changes every year in my data. So this is like nominal income from all crops divided by the price index that I calculate. This is a CES from the CES preference, and this is the size of land cultivated in the village. So X includes a vector of control variables such as rainfall, and sigma here is, I will talk about it if I have time later. So I estimate sigma of 1.3 from my data. Okay. So I also run an alternative specification that addresses the endogeneity and also the other concerns of identification using, replacing this term by the market access here. Okay. So I have village fixed effect and year fixed effect. So this is the results following the binary treatment. So we see that there is 16.9% increase in real income following the road connection. And the market access approach gives us, so looking at the IV result, which is the most preferred one, it shows about the elasticity of real revenue to market access is about 0.31. And this translates into, like, for a village with average change in market access, this is about 15% increase in real agricultural income. Okay. So the next result is to look at, so we say, as I mentioned earlier, cereal and non-cereal producing villages might gain differently. So as you see here, cereal producing villages gain significantly less compared to non-cereal producing villages. And we see the similar kind of result using the market access approach, but the quantity is tiny here. Okay, so the cereal share is a standardized measure of. So I have a standardized. So this is one standard deviation higher cereal share compared to the mean village. Okay, so now I will talk about the mechanisms. So, our toy model implies that the main mechanisms through which this decrease in trade costs should affect welfare in our simplified version is that the road connection should increase the relative price of comparative advantage crops, and second, the village should reallocate more land to these crops, so that this will translate into higher nominal income in what we have here. Okay, on the numerator, and of course, the effect of the decrease in trade cost on village price index is ambiguous depending on the composition of their production and consumption. So the main challenge here is we have to define what the village comparative advantage crop is. So for that, I have measure of yield of village level yield of crops. So what I do is first I calculate the village yield relative to national average for each crop. So this is average productivity of crop K nationally, and this is the productivity of crop K in village V. So this is the village relative productivity compared to the national average. Next, within each village, I rank crops based on their relative yield. Okay. Then I define crops in the top 20% as the baseline comparative advantage crops for the village. And of course, I relax this threshold to top 30% or 40%. And also, I use just the rank, the relative average as a measure of comparative advantage. And so that is how we define the comparative advantage. Okay. So first I show the effect on prices of comparative advantage crops. So this is log price of crop K in village V. So this is monthly price. So I didn't aggregate at year level because, you know, seasonal fluctuation is probably important. So yeah, so this is log price at village V for crop K, the market access of the village. So I interact that with the comparative advantage dummy. So whether crop K is the village comparative advantage crop. So I have crop fixed effect, month year fixed effect, and village fixed effect. Okay. So this is the result. So it's the OLF result. And as you see that, you know, the prices of the comparative advantage crops increase relative to, you know, the other crops, following an increase in market access or road connection. Okay, so whenever, you know, this is my preferred, like I consider like top 20% crops like as a comparative advantage crops. So the price of comparative advantage crops increases by 3.6%. Okay. So next is to look at the effect of the roads on reallocation of farmland to comparative advantage crops. So again, so we have market access and comparative advantage dummy and interaction of the two. So the result is very similar to the previous one. So because here, you know, our dependent variable is the fraction of land allocated to crop. So this, you know, the interpretation is like this translates into about 4% increase in the fraction of land allocated to comparative advantage crop. Okay, so this is overall, it is between 3 and 4% increase in the fraction of land allocated to comparative advantage crop following the road expansion.
Could I have a quick clarifying question? The way you construct your comparative advantage, how do I separate that from, like, for instance, a scale economy type of story? Like you know, you just had you know, you just have something that you have a scale economy rather than comparative advantage. It seems like that by your definition, it's hard to tell apart these two type of stories.
So this is productivity. So this is quantity of crop produced per hectare. So the A term, okay?
Yeah, but it's measured productivity. You know, it's kind of like you can have fixed costs involved in there. You know, I need to buy a certain amount of fertilizer. You know, for like, you know, if I have a very small acre versus a very large acre, you know, maybe there's something just fixed.
All right, okay, so I see. Okay, so alternatively, what I do is I have Gaius data that predicts productivity of each village in each crop based on the temperature of that location, the soil characteristics of the location, and a number of agronomic characteristics. Okay, so as a robustness to like the measured productivity, I use that one. So that one is just predicted based on satellite data on temperature, rainfall, soil characteristics, and under different input usage assumptions. Okay, so I use that, and that is robust to like what you have said, like the scale issue where, you know, you when you use a small land, probably your productivity might be high. So that is yeah, that solves that problem. So I have my results are robust to that productivity measure as well. Okay, did that answer your question, Patrick?
Yeah, sounds good. Sounds good. Yeah, go ahead.
All right, so yeah, so this is the result for land reallocation, which is 3 to 4% increase in the fraction of farmland allocated to comparative advantage crops. Okay.
Just a quick question, just to follow up. I have no idea like the products that these guys produce, but is there any time to build in the sense that like an orchard takes a while to shift, and so you see like different elasticities at different horizons?
Okay, so yeah. Okay, so I forgot to mention it, but so here what I do, so all my previous results so far, they are based on 25 major crops that are relatively widely produced, and non-tree crops, because non-tree crops probably takes time to adjust. For example, coffee, it takes about 5 years to adjust the production of coffee, or other tree crops, basically. So I exclude those in my basic analysis, but including them doesn't change actually the result that much. So I have it in the robustness exercise.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
Okay, so yeah, so the final result here is to see the effect on village price index. So what happens here is when we use the binary treatment, we see like village price index increases, but basically, in this has the previous estimations, we don't see any change in the village price index due to road connection. So this is because, prices of crops change depending on whether the crops are comparative advantage crops or disadvantaged crops. So they tend to cancel out each other. So we don't have a significant effect on price index here. Okay, so next I look at how different villages gain in terms of welfare. So one argument is that do we have to connect the villages that are very close to towns and ignore others which have probably high economic potential, or yeah. So this basically tries to answer what happens, how much does the welfare gain vary across villages based on their remoteness. Okay, and so as a measure of remoteness, I use distance to towns, the nearest towns, which with over 20,000 population, distance to the trunk roads, and distance to the pre-existing URR AP roads, that means the pre-existing road network. And it appears that villages that are distant from remote villages tend to gain less than the non-remote village in terms of welfare. And here, it could be that, even though the roads tend to decrease trade costs, probably the trade cost does not decrease enough to induce a trade of the remote village with the urban centers, probably. Okay, so as a robustness exercise, I actually conduct a number of robustness tests. So the first is an alternative way of addressing the identification concern here. So instead of using the IV, what would happen if we use, say, matching-based difference in difference? So by that, I mean, I first obtain a matched sample of treated and non-treated villages that get connection and not get connection, based on the village characteristics before the program was launched, such as population density, land gradient, rainfall, distance to road, and other factors. So once I obtain a matched sample of treated and untreated villages, I conduct just the difference in difference estimation strategy using the market access approach or just the binary treatment. Okay, so the results here are very similar to what we saw. So this is what the matching looks like. So except for few untreated villages, there's this large area of common support. So that shows the quality of the match, and the welfare gain is about 12.5% here, and so this translates to about 9%. So it's relatively smaller, and also because probably we lose some power also, and the price of comparative advantage crops, they increase by almost the same magnitude as the main specification. Okay, all right. And also, okay. Yeah, so yeah, this one also increases, this is the reallocation of farmland towards comparative advantage crops. This is also almost the same magnitude as the main specification. Okay, so another robustness exercise I do is I include all the 45 crops for which I have price and production data. So all the previous results were based on the 25 major crops, widely produced crops, and non-tree crops. And including all the crops doesn't change any of the results. And another is related to your previous question. I use, instead of the measure of productivity that is provided by the statistical authority, I use the GAIS data on productivity that is predicted based on just agronomic factors. And the result is quite similar to the main result, okay? Okay, so just to conclude, so what I do in this paper is I study how large-scale road construction affects welfare in village economies. I first provide evidence that the roads improved market integration, and estimate an average welfare gain of 15% for a village that gets an average level of increase in market access. And also provide a robust empirical evidence on the mechanisms through which the roads affect welfare. Basically, I show that the road connection leads to increases in relative price of locally produced or local comparative advantage crops, and that induces more farmland reallocation to these crops and translates into more gain in terms of real revenue from crops. Okay, that's all. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll open the line for questions or comments.
Could I have maybe this is too much a general question, but there has been now a very long line of literature thinking about intermediation in the agriculture market in these countries. Like their work by like Jonathan's colleague, for instance, Shumitra about India and Lauren Berquist in Kenya. They all basically thinking about just you being modeling these agriculture being like almost frictionless. And the only thing matters is the trade cost, but effectively there's a kind of like quite strong market power by these intermediaries in these countries. You are the one on the ground, so you possibly know the Ethiopian market better. But just wonder, what's your view of like how the intermediary is being playing a role here in terms of these agricultural goods trade. And effectively, I think it's also interesting that you find there's a price increase in terms of these comparative advantage, what do you call comparative advantage crops, which might actually shed a light on also thinking about the market power of the intermediation there.
Right. Okay. So one thing that is so who gains from? So there is some sort of gain in terms of like reallocation of farmland to the most productive crops, but what happens? Like from the anecdotes is that now because there are roads that go to like the village centers, the intermediaries now can operate like very efficiently. So it means like they can now just drive into the village. Before they couldn't do that because these villages are not accessible by vehicle. So so one anecdotal information is that farmers see like many intermediaries coming to their village, sort of. So it shows that I think the farmers probably gain, like it is not like the intermediaries would capture all of the results. It's the farmers gain because the opening of the infrastructure has led to more grain traders who go like deep into the village and get the village to the urban centers and get some gain. Before there were, intermediaries, but not probably as many because now it makes entry easy.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was kind of like alluding to. Is like there's a reduction of monopsony power. That's then maybe what you observe if you are documenting what you call the price is the bargaining outcome. Then it's really just thinking about because of this reduction of monopsony power, that farmers gaining more. I just don't know whether the price you describe in your data is really the price that farmers been obtaining, or there's some other prices. So it does matter for your story.
Well, so okay, so these prices are, so the prices at the farmers level. The price in my data are the price at the farmers level. But as you said, so this comes back to like, what's the mechanism now? Is it like because of the road now there are more intermediaries so that they are competing with each other and offering better price? Or yeah, that could be part of the story, as you said. Yeah. Actually, it's good to probably, if there is a way to quantify that, yeah, I'll think about it.
So I was going to ask, so all your IVs, your IV estimates are larger than your OLS estimates.
Right.
Yeah, so how do we think about like what that means?
So actually, so if you take, for example, let's go to the result for the welfare. Okay, so this is, yeah. So this 0.3, so for a village with, so this is elasticity, right? So to see how much the welfare real income changes for a village with average level of market assets, you have to multiply this by the average level of market assets. If you do that, you get 0.15, which is close to this. So it is not really, this is a demi variable. This is a continuous variable.
I see.
Yeah, so they are not very way off. This is 0.15. This is 0.17.
So then, in response to Kim's question, like the selection issue doesn't seem large.
The selection issue doesn't seem large, but it's not just the selection issue, because we also have spillover and this, these issues also. Sure. So, fine. And they tend to operate in the. They're not always in the same direction. The selection probably may lead to overestimation, right? And spillover effect leads to underestimation. So they tend to kind of cancel out each other. So it's not clear whether they have to be, the OLS have to be larger than the IV.
I guess the way you could address is really depend on policy objective. You could think about this being upward bias, but on the other hand, if the purpose of building the road is to kind of poverty elevation, it can have a negatively correlated. So, I don't think you do have to defend yourself to say it have to definitely go up or go down. Really come back to the backward kind of the incentive why you were building the road in the first place.
Well, that's exactly what I'm asking is like, where is this revealing the road builders' incentives about where they wanted to place it, and it could go different ways. That's what it sounds like. I think your answer that this stuff kind of is just canceling out is, that's like Alwyn Young has these papers and kind of talks about some of this issue about, this is just some divine coincidence. This stuff cancels out and it's A-okay. And that's kind of looks like what. That sounds good too. So,
can I ask about the magnitudes of the results? Like, you had this big welfare number at the very end, and you started out at the very beginning with like a big number for the cost of building the roads. Is there any way of converting that into like a return?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. So, yeah, I will try to have that like the back of envelope calculation. So this welfare effect, by the way, is not really big when compared to like, at this, the country has been growing like very fast. So there's on average of 10% growth at that time of, during this period. So it's like 15% increase in real income over 5 years. It's not a big, it's not like very big as it seems.
Yeah, but it's permanent, right? And so anyhow, it'd be useful to sort of compare the numbers and just sort of see like what kind of, just so we can kind of decide how many more roads to build or not. So.
Good point. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
It's kind of like the calculation in the previous paper, right? Like when you net out the trade costs, the gains aren't so big. And so here, you kind of want to see how much was given up to get that extra income. So,
yeah. Right, yeah. Yes, actually, it's the only information required here is the cost per kilometer of the roads. Once that is obtained, I think, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you could do it by village, or if you wanted to. But anyhow, thanks.
Right. Any other question or suggestion?
So I actually had a thought, which was when you first started showing the results on the prices, it seemed much more about, you showed differences by the perishability of the goods, cereals versus, fruits. I wonder to what extent like this is really about the roads lowering the time to get from one place to the other versus the distance. So
the distance
and that's going to be.
Okay, so the distance was the same, right? This is just the roads. When the roads come, it's easier to transport it's easier to move them quickly. So it's basically vehicles. Before there were no vehicles, so these are not accessible by vehicles. Now, when they become accessible, what benefits more is like I don't have it here in terms of, but for example, the same happens, for example, for milk. So because I'm focusing here on crops, so the perishable ones, they see like a much decrease in the rural urban price gap. So that is probably
Yeah, no, I was just thinking that some places were probably harder to get to the urban centers than before, and the reduction in distance, the reduction in time to get to the urban centers was very different, and so it's kind of like a bigger shock for some places versus other places, and would end up having like a different impact on the crop mix if you had some measure of the kind of how easy it was to get to the urban centers before versus after.
Okay. Other than the road, okay. I will think about that. Okay.
I think you follow Sotelo and assuming people stay in their village. It doesn't play a big role since they're not an input into production, but they are consumers, I guess. So they determine demand. You didn't say anything about population relocation, and I just wondered, is it fair to say that people are pretty much staying in their villages, or has there been much relocation?
Yeah, so so I'm assuming that people are staying in at their village, and it probably reflects the reality also. What could happen is the road may help them to like temporarily go out to the towns and work and go back home, like temporal or like daily migration. But relocation is probably unlikely for the farmers because they're pretty much their livelihood is tied to their land, and yeah. That answer your question. Sorry. Hello.
Okay. Yeah. So I think Roman or George